Hey there, and welcome back. If you have come here at the end of a long day with the lamp low and the house gone quiet around you, then you have come to the right place, and you may let your shoulders down now and let the day go. There is nothing left tonight that needs doing. There is only this, the quiet and the dark, and a story to be carried down into sleep. And tonight, the story is about a mother and her children, which is the oldest story there is. Though this particular telling of it runs through more glory and more grief than almost any other we know. We are going back more than 500 years into the England of the late Middle Ages to sit beside a woman who brought 12 children into the world and lived to follow almost every one of them into the grave. She saw 2 of her sons crowned kings. She saw one of them drowned, it was said, in a barrel of sweet wine, on the order of his own brother. She saw 2 of her small grandsons vanish into the dark of a great fortress and never come out. And she lived long enough to learn that her last living son had been cut down upon a battlefield with a crown of gold about his helmet. Tonight is the story of those children, every one of them, and of the mother who bore them and loved them and outlived them. And there is one among them whose dying was so strange that men have told the tale of it for 500 years, and we will come to him in time, when the fire has burned a little lower. Before we set out, let me say a quiet word to you, the one who has chosen to spend these hours here, because there are a great many places you might have gone tonight, and you came to this one. If you find, somewhere in the hours ahead, that this telling has done its work, that it has carried you a little way out of your own day and down towards sleep, then you would be welcome to stay a while. To let this be a place you come back to when the nights are long. There is a small, quiet way to do that, with the button beneath this, and it costs you nothing and lets me know you would like to find your way back here again. And if you have a moment before you drift, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight and what the hour is where you are, the town or the country or the city. The rain on your window, or the snow, or the warm dark, for the messages come to me from all over the world, from people lying just as you are lying now in the quiet, and I look through them, every one, and they are one of the great pleasures of these evenings, but that can wait. For now there is only the road, and the woman at the end of it, and her children. So picture this, it is late in the autumn of a year, near the very close of the 15th century, and in a great house of pale stone, an old woman sits alone before a low fire. She is very near the end of her long life now, upright, still in her tall chair, her hands folded over a small worn book of prayers, her pale eyes fixed on the embers, as though she were reading something written there that only she can see. The room is warm and still. Beyond the shutters, the early dark has come down over the bare trees and the cold fields, and the old woman sits and remembers, for she has more to remember than almost anyone alive. She has buried a husband and most of a dozen children. She has seen her blood set upon the throne of England, and seen it torn down again into the dust. She is the last of them now, the last survivor of a family that gathered a whole kingdom into its hands, and then tore itself to pieces from the inside. And as the fire sinks, she sees their faces in it, one after another, all her children, the living and the lost. This is the Lady Cecily, Duchess of York, and tonight, by her fire, we are going to meet her children, every one of them, and learn through her what became of each. So let us draw close and begin to meet her children. We must first meet her, and that we can do quickly. For though her own beginnings were grand enough, they are not the story we have come for. She was born a daughter of the far north, the youngest child of one of the mightiest earls in England. Raised in the cold, strong castles of the border country, among a swarm of brothers and sisters. The country people, it is said, called her the Rose of Raby, for the castle of her birth, and Proud Cis, for the bearing that never left her all her days. And the second name fits her quite as well as the first. Pride was bred into her with her blood, for she was close kin to half the leading houses of the land, and she carried the knowledge of it like a second spine. For she came of an enormous family, the most prolific and far-reaching of all the noble clans of the north, and to understand her, you must see the web of kin. She stood at the centre of. Her father had fathered a vast brood of children, sons and daughters by the dozen, and he had married them, one after another, into the greatest houses of the realm. So that by the time Cecily was grown, she had brothers and sisters, and half-brothers and half-sisters, scattered across the whole of the high nobility, an earl here, and a baron there, and a great lady somewhere else. A spreading net of brothers and cousins and nephews that reached into every corner of the land. To be born into that family was to be born already connected to everyone who mattered, already woven into the politics of the kingdom by ties of blood, and it gave her, from the cradle, an assurance of her own place in the world that nothing could ever shake. Her brothers would become some of the most powerful men of their age, makers and breakers of kings, and her sisters the mothers of more great lords still. She was not a solitary figure who married into greatness. She was a daughter of greatness, bred at the heart of the mightiest kindred in the north, and the pride that the world found so insufferable in her was at bottom the simple, unquestioning pride of one who had never for a moment doubted that she belonged among the very first people of the realm. All her life she would keep the state of a queen and the will of a commander. The two names the world gave her tell us almost everything. The Rose of Raby was the lovely young woman of the north, the earl's daughter, beautiful and high-born, and the pride of her great family, and that name carries the bloom and the promise of her early years. But Proud Cis was the name that stuck, the name that followed her down the long decades, and it was not entirely a name of affection. It marked her out as a woman whose pride was famous even among the proudest people in the land. A woman who held herself like royalty, who claimed the dignities and the precedence of the very highest rank, who kept, in her household and her bearing, a state that some thought too grand even for the mother of a king. She would sign herself, in her later years, with the style of a queen, claim a queen's honours, hold a queen's court, and woe betide anyone who failed to give her her due. To some this was insufferable arrogance, the vanity of an old woman clinging to grandeur. But there was steel beneath it, not mere vanity, for the pride was of a piece with the strength, the same unbending sense of who she was that let her survive every blow that fell on her. A softer woman would have broken under what Cecily endured. The hardness that made her difficult was the same hardness that made her unbreakable, and the two cannot be separated. She was proud, yes, proud past the liking of many, and she was also, by the same token, one of the most formidable and enduring figures of her whole formidable age, a woman of iron in a world that tested iron to destruction, and survived the testing where almost everyone around her did not. But the house she was born into is not what tonight is about. Tonight is about the children she would bear, and so we may pass lightly over her own girlhood and come quickly to the marriage that made her a mother, for it was as a mother, far more than as a daughter or even as a duchess, that she would meet the deepest joys and the deepest sorrows of her long life. The man she married was Richard, Duke of York, and him too we may meet briefly. For his place in our story is above all that he was the father of these children and the source of the blood that would carry them so high and bring them down so far. He had come to her family as a boy, an orphan of the greatest blood in England, his own father executed and his lands held in the king's hand, a child of enormous inheritance and enormous danger. He was raised alongside the Neville children and betrothed, in the way of great families, to the youngest daughter of the house. And so the two of them grew up half together and were married while they were both still young. Two children of the high nobility, joined to bind two powerful houses. What no one arranging the match could have foreseen was that it would also become, by every sign we have, a true and lasting marriage, a partnership of more than 60 years that held through exile and war and ended only in blood. This is worth dwelling on, for it was the foundation beneath everything, the long, steady marriage at the root of the whole family. In an age when the unions of the great were matters of pure policy, made by others and endured rather than chosen, theirs grew into something rarer, a real and a working partnership of two formidable people who seemed genuinely to have trusted and relied upon one another across the whole of their adult lives. He went where the king's business and his own ambition took him, to France, to Ireland, to the council and the camp. And she went with him as often as not, sharing his exiles and his dangers, bearing his children in foreign cities and border castles, keeping his houses and his honour, a true consort to him in every sense. When his fortunes fell and he was driven from the kingdom, she stood by him and shared the fall. When his enemies threatened, she faced them, and there are stories of her standing her ground with great courage in dangerous moments while he was away, holding the family's place by her own nerve. They built the whole edifice of the House of York together, the man and the woman, across more than half a century, and the 12 children were the fruit of it. The living proof of a marriage that had begun as a bargain between families and become, against all the odds of its age, a genuine union of two strong lives. And when it ended in blood. The man cut down at Wakefield with their second son beside him, leaving her a widow after 30 years, with 30 more still to live alone. The long second half of her life, all of it, was lived in the shadow of that lost partnership. The proud woman who had been half of so strong a pairing left to go on without him, carrying the memory of him through all the triumphs and the disasters that he did not live to see. And out of it came the long, unbroken line of sons and daughters who are the heart of tonight. Now, the bearing of those children was no small thing, and before we name them one by one, it is worth sitting for a moment in the world where they came into being, for it was a world very far from our own. Imagine the close, warm chamber where a noblewoman of that age was brought to bed, the windows shuttered and the heavy hangings drawn against every draught of air, the room kept dim and hot and sealed. For the wisdom of the time held that the cold and the light were dangerous to a labouring woman. There were no men there, none at all, not even the husband, for the birth chamber was a wholly female world, the door closed against the world of men. There were the midwives, and the gathered women of the household, and the family, the mother, and the sisters, and the gossips, come to attend, and to help, and to pray. There was the basin of warm water, and the clean linen, the candles burning low, the murmur of women's voices, and the old prayers said over and over. And there, in that sealed and crowded warmth, in pain and in real danger, a duchess did the work that every woman of every rank did then. The bringing of a child into the world with nothing between her and death, but the skill of the women around her and the mercy of God. This was the one great arena in which a woman of that age was wholly sovereign and wholly alone, the birth chamber from which all men were shut out, and it is worth honouring it. For it was where the whole future of every great house was decided, in blood and pain, by the women. Kings made war and lords made policy, but it was here, in the sealed and curtained room, that the heirs were made, that the lines were carried on or broke, that the dynasties lived or died, and it was women's work entirely, done by women, attended by women, survived or not survived by women, with the men pacing helplessly somewhere beyond the closed door. A noblewoman went into that room knowing she might not come out of it alive, for childbed killed without regard for rank, carried off duchesses and queens as readily as cottagers' wives, and there was little anyone could do if things went wrong but pray. She made her confession beforehand, and set her soul in order, and said her farewells, as a soldier might before a battle. For it was a battle, the most dangerous most women ever fought. And they fought it again and again across their childbearing years with a quiet matter-of-fact courage that the chronicles busy with the doings of men almost never thought to record. Cecily fought that battle a dozen times and won it every time, walked into the valley of the shadow a dozen times and walked out again. And we should remember that, beneath all her grander titles, as one of the truest measures of her strength. She was, first and last, and through everything, a survivor. And her survival began here, in the women's room, in the oldest and most dangerous arena there is. For childbirth in that age was perilous, the most perilous thing most women ever did, and a great lady in her curtained bed was no safer in the moment of it than the poorest woman in her cottage. Cecily passed through that sealed chamber, not once or twice, but again and again, year upon year, for the better part of 2 decades, bearing child after child into the dangerous world, and surviving it every time, where so many women did not. And the world into which those children were born and raised is worth seeing for itself, for it was utterly unlike the settled domestic world we know. This was no quiet family in a single house. It was a great noble household, a whole moving world of hundreds of people, and it did not stay in one place, but travelled, season by season, from castle to castle and manor to manor across the family's scattered lands, so that the children grew up on the road quite as much as anywhere. Imagine the procession of it, the long train of carts and wagons piled high with the goods of a great house, the beds and the hangings and the plate and the kitchen gear. For in that age, a lord carried his whole establishment with him when he moved, and a castle stood half empty until its master came and filled it. Imagine the riders, the men-at-arms, and the servants, and the officers of the household, the nurses and the children in their litters or on their ponies, the whole straggling snake of a moving court winding along the muddy roads of medieval England from one of the family's strongholds to the next. The children of York were citizens of no single place, but of the House of York itself, wherever it happened to be, raised in a constant procession of arrivals and departures, of unpacking and repacking a whole way of life. And when the household came to rest in one of the great castles, the children grew up in a world of stone and smoke and ceremony that we would find at once magnificent and strangely harsh. The halls were vast and cold, warmed only by the roaring fires at their hearths, lit by candles and rushlights against the early dark, hung with tapestries to keep out the draughts and to show the wealth of the family. There was the constant business of a great house, the cooking for hundreds in the cavernous kitchens, the brewing and the baking, the stabling of the horses, the endless work of the servants, who kept the whole machine running. There were the rituals of rank, the formal meals in the great hall, with the family raised on the dais, and the household ranged below by careful degree. The grace said, and the dishes brought in procession, the whole elaborate theatre of a noble table. There were the chapels where the family heard mass and the offices, for the rhythm of the day was set as much by the bells of prayer as by the meals. And through all of it moved the children, a little band of small great persons, watched over by their nurses, schooled by their tutors, learning from the cradle the manners and the bearing and the iron sense of their own importance that their blood required. It was a grand way to grow up, and a cold one, in some ways, by our lights. The children raised more by servants than by parents, drilled in ceremony, taught duty before tenderness. Picture the shape of an ordinary day for those children in the bright years before the storm. They woke in their chambers high in the cold stone of the castle, and were dressed by their attendants in the rich small garments of their rank. For even children of such a house were clothed as miniature lords and ladies, in good wool and fine linen, and on great days, in silk. They heard mass in the chapel, for the day of a noble household began with God. The whole family gathered to hear the office before the business of the day. They were fed at the proper hours, the younger ones apart, the older ones beginning to take their places at the great table. And then there were the long hours of their schooling, for the children of York were not idle. The boys went to their tutors to learn their letters and their Latin grammar, the reading and the writing, that a High Lord would need. And then out to the yard and the field to learn the harder lessons of their sex, to ride and to handle a sword and a lance, to fly a hawk, to bear the weight of armour, all the arts of war and lordship that a man of their blood would one day have to command. The girls learned a different curriculum, but no easier one. The management of a vast household, with its hundreds of servants and its endless accounts. The skills of the needle, the playing of music, the courtesies and the graces and the iron self-possession that a noble wife would need to hold her own among the great. And over and through all of it ran the one central lesson that the whole upbringing was designed to teach: the knowledge of who they were, the pride and the duty of their name. Drilled into them from the cradle until it was as much a part of them as their own bones. It made them, this hard grand education, into exactly what their world required: proud, capable, dutiful, fitted to rule and to marry and to lead. And it is worth seeing for a moment the places where this raising was done, for two of them above all hold the beginning and the end of the whole story. There was Raby, away in the cold far north, the castle of her own birth, a vast frowning fortress of dark stone set among the bleak hills of the border country, its great towers rising over a hard green land of moor and wind, a stronghold built for war in a country that had known little else. And it was there, in those echoing northern halls, that the Rose of Raby herself had come into the world. And then there was Fotheringhay, away in the gentler Midland country, the chief seat of her husband's house, a fair, strong castle by a slow river, with a fine church beside it that the family had raised and beautified to be the resting place of their line. Between those two places, the harsh northern fortress of her birth and the gentler southern castle of her marriage, the whole arc of her life was strung. She was born at the one and would be buried at the other, carried home at the very end to lie in the family church at Fotheringhay beside her husband, in the same gentle country where so many of the children had been brought up. The places themselves were characters in the story: the cold, strong north that bred her, and the fair Midland seat where the House of York kept its state, and the children grew up moving between such places, between fortress and palace and manor, learning in stone and tower and hall the grandeur and the weight of the name they bore. And they learned, too, the signs and emblems of that name, for a great house in that age spoke a language of badges and colours that everyone could read, and the marks of the House of York were stamped on everything the children knew. On the banners and the liveries, the carved stone and the painted glass, the very plate they ate from. There was the white rose, the flower that would come to stand for the whole house and the whole cause, blazoned and embroidered and carved wherever the family held sway, a thing of beauty that would also become, in time, the emblem of a losing side and a doomed dream. There was the falcon and the fetterlock, an older badge of the line, a bird of prey bound within a lock, that the family wore as their private sign. And the children grew up among these marks, as a child grows up among the familiar furniture of home, knowing the rose and the falcon for their own, wearing them, sleeping beneath them, never doubting that the signs of York were the signs of greatness. It is a poignant thing to think of now, for those same emblems that decked their bright childhood would one day be torn down and trampled, the white rose pulled up by the roots, the badges of the house struck from the walls by the dynasty that supplanted them. But the children did not know that. To them the rose was simply theirs, the mark of who they were, blooming on every banner of their golden youth, in the long bright morning before the night came down. And it was their mother, more than anyone, who saw that it was done, the formidable Duchess presiding over the shaping of her children into the men and women the house would need. But it was the only world they knew, and it was the world their formidable mother ruled, the still strong centre around which all that moving magnificence turned. And not all the children survived it with her. This is the first hard thing we must say about her motherhood, and we must say it plainly, because it shaped everything. Many of her children died. They died as babies and as small children, carried off by the fevers and the fluxes and the coughs of infancy, against which there was then no defence and little understanding. This was the common lot of every mother of the age, queen and cottager alike, for even in the warmest and best-fed households, a woman might bear a dozen children and raise only half of them to be grown. There was no medicine that could save a child once the sickness took hold, only prayers and old remedies and the watching very often ended in a small coffin and a fresh grave. A woman learned, of necessity, to live with this, to love her children fiercely, and yet to hold them with open hands, knowing how easily they might be taken from her. We should not imagine, because such death was common, that it was easy, or that these mothers grieved their lost babies any less than mothers grieve today. The commonness of the sorrow did not lessen its weight, it only spread it more widely. And Cecily knew it as deeply as any woman who ever lived, for she would taste it again and again across her long years of bearing, and carry all those small old griefs within her, beneath the pride and the splendour, all her life. What kind of mother was she to the ones who lived? An exacting one, we may be sure, and a devoted one, in the grave demanding manner of her age and her rank, which was not the soft indulgent manner of our own time, but something harder and more formal. The children of a noble house were not coddled. They were raised to their station, taught from the cradle who they were and what would be required of them, drilled in the courtesies and the accomplishments and the iron self-command that their blood demanded. The boys learned their letters and their Latin, their horsemanship and their hawking and the handling of arms. The girls learned the running of households, the needle and the music and the management that a noble wife would one day need. And all of them learned, above everything, the pride and the duty of their name. Cecily, proud and able and devout, would have presided over all of it, the ordering of the nursery and the schoolroom, the hiring of the nurses and the tutors, the slow shaping of these small souls into the men and women the house required, and she would have done it, one feels sure, with the same exacting force she brought to everything. She was not, we may guess, an easy mother any more than she was an easy woman. She would have demanded much and shown her love as much in the demanding as in the tenderness. But love it was, deep and fierce and real, the love of a mother for the children who were her whole work and her whole hope, and running through everything, through the demanding and the tenderness alike, was her faith. For Cecily was all her life a deeply and seriously religious woman, and this was no small or formal thing, but the very spine of who she was. The piety that would order her last years so strictly was not a thing she came to only in her old age. It had been in her from the first, the bedrock beneath the pride and the ambition, the one constant through every turn of her fortune. She kept the observances of her faith with a rigour that struck even her own devout age, heard her masses, said her prayers, read or had read to her the writings of the great mystics and holy women, and ordered her household to a religious discipline. And we may be sure she raised her children in that same faith, drilled them in their prayers and their catechism, along with their manners and their lessons, taught them to fear God and to keep the offices and to carry their devotion as part of their birthright. It was a hard faith in some ways, the faith of an age that lived close to death and took sin and judgment with deadly seriousness. But it was also, for such a woman, a great source of strength. The thing that held her upright through losses that would have shattered a soul with nothing to lean on. When the children died, it told her where they had gone. When the world fell apart, it gave her something that could not be taken. And at the very end, when everything else was lost, it was all she had left. And it was enough, for it had always, underneath everything, been the truest thing about her. And over the bright nursery years, all the while, a shadow was lengthening, though the children did not see it. For the England into which Cecily brought her children was a kingdom sliding slowly and then swiftly toward catastrophe. The king who reigned over it, Henry, was a gentle, pious, broken man, kindly and well-meaning, and wholly unfit to rule, prone to spells of a clouded illness in which he sat unknowing for months together, a wholly innocent upon the throne of a hard and hungry realm. Around that empty centre, the mighty men of the kingdom began to circle and to quarrel, and Cecily's husband, with his powerful blood and his real grievances and his growing sense that he, and not the king's grasping favourites, ought to govern, was drawn steadily toward the heart of the gathering storm. And we should not forget, behind the quarrels of the great, the country itself, the whole realm of England, that would be torn for a generation by this struggle among its lords. For the wars that consumed Cecily's children were fought across a living land full of ordinary people. The farmers and the townsfolk, and the craftsmen who wanted nothing but to be left in peace, to bring in their harvests and ply their trades, and who found themselves, again and again, in the path of marching armies. Men were summoned from their fields to fight and die for quarrels. They barely understood, called out by the lords they were bound to serve, marched the length of the kingdom to stand in the line of battle on some cold field and be cut down in their thousands. Towns were taken and sacked. The country round about a battle stripped bare by the passing hosts. The slow, patient work of ordinary lives smashed in an afternoon by the ambitions of the mighty. It was not a constant war, mercifully. For long stretches the land was quiet, and the people went about their business, and the great battles, terrible as they were brief and far apart. But the threat of it hung over everything, the knowledge that at any time the lords might call out their men again, and the armies might come marching, and a whole generation grew up under that shadow. This was the realm that Cecily's husband reached to govern, and her sons to rule, and the price of all their greatness was paid, in the end, not only by the family itself, but by the countless ordinary people who bled and died in the long quarrel of the mighty houses. The crown that two of her sons wore was a heavy thing, and it sat upon a kingdom that had paid for it dearly, and the wisest of them knew it. And the peace that Edward gave the land in his good years was valued so highly, precisely because the people had learned in blood what the want of it cost. All of this would come crashing down upon her children in time. It would crown some of them and kill others, and scatter the rest. But it had not come yet, and they grew up, for a while, in happy ignorance of the fate that was being prepared for them. A brood of strong and promising children in the long golden afternoon of a great family before the night came down. There were 12 of them in all, born across the better part of 2 decades, and we will meet each one, the ones who lived and the ones who did not. For every one of them was hers, and every one of them has a place in the long account of her motherhood. Some of their names ring down the centuries still, the kings and the great duchess, and some are little more than names now, the small ones who came and went. But she knew them all and loved them all, and we will give each one their due tonight, in her company, by her fire. Let us go to them now, and meet them as she met them, one after another, in the order the years brought them. Let us begin, where so much of her motherhood began and ended, with the children who did not stay. For before we come to the kings and the duchess and the rest, we should give a moment to the others, the ones whose names are little more than names now. The babies and the small children who came into the world in that curtained chamber and went out of it again before they could be truly known. There were several of them across the years. There was a first daughter, born early in the marriage, who did not live. There were sons, named for the hopes their parents had of them, who did not live either. A Henry and a William and a John and a Thomas, names set down in the old records and then quietly closed, each one a small grave and a small grief. There was a daughter named Ursula, the very last child she bore, who came when Cecily was near the end of her childbearing years, and who, like so many of the others, slipped away almost as soon as she had come. We know almost nothing of these lost children, for the world that kept careful track of the sons who lived to inherit cared little to record the ones who died small. We have, for most of them, only a name and the bare fact of a short life. But we should not let them pass without a word, for they were her children too, carried and born in pain and danger, like all the rest, hoped for and named and loved, and then lost. Each of them was, for their mother, exactly what a lost child is for any mother, a wound that does not close, a small absence carried forever afterward in the quiet places of the heart. It is worth pausing on what such a loss meant, and how it was met in that distant age, for the people of the Middle Ages lived far closer to death than we do, and they had built around it a whole framework of faith and ritual that both softened the blow and in its way deepened it. A child who died was carried to the church and buried with the prayers of the church, and the parents were taught to believe, and very many of them truly did believe, that a baptized child who died went straight and clean to heaven. An innocent soul gathered early into the arms of God, spared all the sins and sorrows of a long, hard life. There was real comfort in that belief, and we should not doubt that it brought genuine consolation to grieving mothers, the certainty that the small one was not lost, but only gone ahead, safe and blessed. Waiting. A woman of Cecily's deep faith would have clung to exactly that hope over each small grave, the conviction that her lost babies were with God and that she would see them again. And yet the comfort did not cancel the grief, any more than faith cancels grief today. The empty cradle was still empty, the small shoes were still small and still there. The arms that had held a living child still ached for the weight of it. Faith told her where the child had gone, and that was a great thing, but it did not stop the heart from breaking. And Cecily's heart, for all its hardness, was not made of stone. And there is something else to say of these losses, which is how they shaped the love she could give to the children who lived. A woman who has buried several babies learns of grim necessity, a certain guardedness of the heart, a way of loving that holds a little back, that does not let itself believe too completely in the survival of any child until the child is safely grown. She loves fiercely, but she loves braced for loss, always half expecting the small cough that turns to fever, the bright morning that turns to a death watch by nightfall. There is a particular quality to the love of a mother in such an age, a love that has been schooled by repeated loss into a kind of brave, sorrowful tenderness, hoping always and trusting never. And Cecily would have loved all her surviving children in exactly that way, the way of a woman who had stood too often by a small grave to take any living child for granted. It is one of the quiet differences between her world and ours, this everyday intimacy with the death of children, and it lay beneath everything else in her motherhood, a foundation of old sorrow on which all the later, grander sorrows would be built. We talk of Cecily as the mother of kings, and so she was, but she was also, and just as truly, the mother of these, the small ones who never grew, and the burying of them was as much a part of her long story as the crowning of the sons who lived. Try, for a moment, to feel the rhythm of it, the terrible rhythm of a noble woman's childbearing years, the round of swelling and bearing, and either rejoicing or grieving over and over, season after season, for the better part of 20 years. A child quickening, and the long wait, and the dangerous hour of the birth, and then either the joy of a living infant, or the silence of one that did not breathe, or the slower heartbreak of a baby that lived a few weeks or a few months and then sickened and faded, and barely time to grieve before the next was on the way. This was the shape of her life through all the bright years, the relentless cycle of hope and loss that was simply what it meant to be a married woman of her age and rank, expected to give her husband children and to keep on giving them, whatever the cost to her body and her heart. And the last of them, the very last child she ever bore, was the little daughter, Ursula, who came when Cecily was already past the usual years of childbearing. A late and unlooked-for child arriving when her mother might have thought that part of her life was over. There is a particular tenderness, often, about a last child, the one that comes when the others are already half-grown, the unexpected late blessing, and one wonders whether Cecily, holding this final baby, felt the bittersweet weight of knowing it would be her last, the closing of the long fertile chapter of her life. But Ursula, like so many of the others, did not stay. She slipped away small, as the others had one more tiny grave to set beside the rest, the last of the lost, the final closing of the long account of Cecily's childbearing. After Ursula, there were no more. The door of that part of her life swung shut, and what remained was the raising of the ones who had lived, and in time, the burying of them too. We know nothing of Ursula, but her name and the fact of her brief life. But she was real, a real small daughter, really born and really lost, the youngest and last of all that great brood. And she deserves her moment among her brothers and sisters, the little one who came at the very end and stayed the shortest time of all, and whom her mother, we may be sure, mourned as she had mourned all the others, quietly, deeply, and without the world ever knowing. That she came through it at all, that she bore so many and survived every birth, is itself remarkable, for many women did not. And that she could bury child after child, and gather herself each time, and go on, holding the household steady, raising the ones who lived, keeping her dignity and her faith intact through all of it, tells us something about her that no list of her grand titles ever could. She was made, this woman, of something very hard and very strong, and the making of it began here, in the nursery and at the small graves, long before the wars ever touched her. So we begin our roll of her children with these, the lost ones, the first daughter and the small sons, and the last daughter Ursula, and we give them their moment, and we let them go gently, as she had to let them go. And then we turn to the ones who lived, the ones whose stories the world remembers, and we find that for them, in the end, the world had sorrows in store quite as deep as these, only longer in the coming. The eldest of her children, who lived to grow, was a daughter, Anne, and there is a particular place in a mother's heart for the first child who lives, the one who makes her, for the first time, truly a mother of the living, and not only a mourner of the lost. We know little of Anne as a small girl, for the records of that age care nothing for the childhoods of daughters, but we may imagine her in the nursery of the great travelling household, the eldest among the babies who came after, growing up in the easy certainty of her own importance, for she was a daughter of York, and her marriage would one day be a matter of state. That, indeed, was the whole shape of a noble daughter's destiny, and Cecily knew it better than anyone, for she had lived it herself. There must have been, in watching this first surviving daughter grow, a strange doubled feeling for her, the joy of the living child set against the certain knowledge of what lay ahead for her, the giving away that was every such girl's fate. She had been a daughter handed across to bind two houses, and her own daughter would be the same, and she could no more spare Anne that destiny than her own mother had spared her. So she raised the girl to it, taught her the graces and the management she would need, prepared her, as a loving mother of that age had to be handed over when the time came, to be loved and raised and cherished, and then, when the time came, to be given away in marriage, to serve the interests of the house, the wishes of the girl herself, a small thing beside the needs of the blood. Cecily would have looked at her growing daughter and known exactly what lay before her, for it was what had lain before her own self. And there must have been in her love a thread of that hard knowledge. The awareness that she was raising this child, in part, to be handed over. And Anne was handed over young, as the daughters of great houses always were, betrothed while she was still a girl and married not long after into one of the mightiest families in the land. The husband chosen for her was Henry Holland, the Duke of Exeter, a man of royal blood himself and vast estates, and on the face of it, a brilliant match. The kind of alliance that knit the great houses together, and that any ambitious father would have been glad to make for his eldest girl. But it went wrong, and it went wrong in a way that shows, as clearly as anything in the whole story, how the gathering quarrel of the age reached its cold hand even into the marriage bed of a young girl. For when the wars came, when the kingdom split into the warring parties of York and the rival house, Anne's husband chose the other side. He became one of the most committed and most violent enemies of her own father, of her own family, of the House of York into which she had been born. And so this young woman found herself bound in marriage to a man who was, in the plainest terms, the enemy of everyone she had come from. Her husband on one side of a war to the death, and her father and brothers on the other. It is hard to imagine a crueler position for a young wife, and we are not told how she bore it. The long misery of a marriage turned to a battlefield, her loyalties torn clean in two, tied for life to a man who was trying to destroy her family. To feel the weight of it, you must understand what marriage was for a girl of Anne's rank, and how little say she had in any of it. A noble daughter was not married for her own happiness, nor even consulted in the matter. She was a piece in the great game of alliances that the families of the high nobility played, a way of binding house to house, of sealing a treaty, or cementing a friendship, or buying a powerful friend. The match was made by her father, in cold negotiation with the father of the groom, the lands and the monies and the advantages all weighed and bargained over like the terms of any other contract. And the girl herself handed across, when the deal was struck, very often to a man she had barely met, sometimes a good deal older than herself, to live out her life in his house and bear his children and serve his interests. This was simply the way of the world she was born to, and most girls accepted it as their lot, for they had been raised to expect nothing else, and a great many such arranged matches grew, in time, into real and contented marriages. But the system depended on the alliance holding, on the two families staying friends, and when the alliance failed, when the houses that the marriage had joined fell out and went to war, the girl in the middle was simply trapped, bound by an unbreakable bond to the enemy of her own blood. That was Anne's fate. She had been married, in good faith, to seal a friendship between two great houses, and then the friendship had shattered into the most savage of civil wars, and she found herself the wife of one of her family's most dangerous enemies. A man who took up arms again and again against her father and her brothers, who would have destroyed the House of York root and branch if he could. We can only imagine the years she spent in that impossible position, in the household of a man at war with everyone she loved, hearing of battles in which her husband fought against her brothers, never knowing on which side the next blow would fall. Her heart divided clean down the middle, with no possible way to make it whole. There was no escape from it, for a wife could not simply leave her husband, however much she might wish to. She was his in-law, and in the eyes of the church, and only the most extraordinary circumstances could ever loose the bond. So she endured, year after wretched year, a young woman caught in the crossfire of her age, paying in her own happiness for a quarrel she had no part in making. And her mother, watching from a distance, could do nothing, for Cecily had given this daughter away into exactly such a marriage as her own had been, never dreaming it would turn to this. And now she could only watch her eldest girl suffer the cruelest possible consequence of the giving away that was every noble daughter's destiny. The marriage was wretched by every sign, and it gave her a daughter and little else but grief. And when at last the wars turned York's way, when her brother came to the throne and her husband's cause lay in ruins, Anne was at last set free of him. The marriage was dissolved. The violent Duke, his fortunes broken, would come to a strange dark end of his own, found drowned one day in the sea off the coast, no one ever quite sure how. And Anne, freed of the husband that policy had chained her to, did, at the very last, a thing that almost no woman of her rank was ever permitted to do. She married for love. She took as her second husband a man far below her in rank, a knight of her brother's household named Thomas, a man she seems genuinely to have wanted, and for a brief while, after all the long misery of the first marriage, she had something like happiness. We should not pass over how rare and how precious that was, for a woman of her rank to marry where her own heart led. The whole world she lived in was built to prevent exactly that, to make the marriages of the great a matter of policy and never of feeling, and a princess of the blood who married a mere knight of the household was doing something almost unheard of, reaching past all the careful machinery of rank and alliance to take, simply, the man she wanted. That she was allowed to do it at all tells us that her brother, the king, for all his faults, loved his sister and wished her some happiness after the wreck of her first marriage, and let her have her way. And so Anne, who had been handed as a girl to a great enemy and spent her youth in misery, was given, near the end, a little span of the thing that almost no woman of her station was ever permitted, a marriage of her own choosing. A husband she had wanted, perhaps even a measure of ordinary love and ordinary peace. It is a small, bright window in a dark life, and we should be glad of it for her sake. The eldest daughter of York, snatching a little happiness at the last, out of a destiny that had given her so little. And then it was taken from her, almost as soon as she had grasped it. The little span of happiness in her second marriage proving heartbreakingly brief, so that she went down into the dark while she was still young, before her own mother, the first of the grown children to be taken back. For Cecily, there was a sharp bitterness in losing this daughter, just as her luck had finally turned, the freedom and the love snatched away almost before they were grasped. And with her eldest girl she learned, for the first time among her grown children, the lesson that all the rest would teach her, in their turn down the long years, that she was a woman fated to outlive the one she loved. It did not last. For Anne, who had survived the wars and the wretched marriage and won her way at last to a little joy, died young, and she died in the oldest and commonest way that women of that age died, in childbed, bearing a child to the husband she had chosen. She was still a young woman, not far into her 30s, when she was carried off in the very act of bringing new life into the world, the same dark doorway through which her own mother had passed so many times and survived. And so the eldest of Cecily's living children went before her into the grave, the first of the grown ones to die, taken not by the wars that killed so many of her brothers, but by the simple, terrible hazard of being a woman and a wife. For the mother, it was the first of the great losses among her grown children, and a bitter one. For Anne's had not been a fortunate life. She had been given away into a marriage that turned to misery. She had been torn between her husband and her blood. She had won her freedom and her love only at the very end, and then been robbed of it almost at once by the perils of childbirth. There is a particular grief in seeing a child's life come to so little after so much, in burying a daughter who had known more sorrow than joy, and Cecily, who had given this girl life and then given her away, now had to give her up altogether. She was the eldest of the living, the first to make Cecily a mother of a child that stayed, and she was among the first of the grown ones to be taken back, and the wheel of the family's fortunes, which would lift some of her children so high, had shown already, in Anne, that it could grind a life very small. Come with me now to her eldest living son, for here the story turns from sorrow toward glory, at least for a while. His name was Edward, and he was born far across the sea, in the city of Rouen, in the Duchy of Normandy, in the days when the English crown still held lands in France, though they were slipping away even as he drew his first breath. He was not Cecily's first child, but he was her first son to live, the long-awaited heir, the boy who would carry the name and the blood and the claim of his father into the next age. and a mother in that world poured into such a son all the fierce ambition she was not herself permitted to spend. From his very birth, he was marked out as the coming man of the house, and Cecily raised him knowing it, watching this particular child with a particular care, for on him, more than on any of the others, the whole future of the family was understood to rest. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of where this golden child was born, for it tells us much about the world he came into. He came into the world in Rouen, the chief city of Normandy, because his father was at that time the king's lieutenant in France, the governor of the English lands across the sea, and so the Duke and his young Duchess kept their state in a foreign city, ruling a conquered province in the king's name. The England of that age still held broad territories in France, the last great remnants of an old dream of empire won by a famous warrior king a generation before, and now, slowly and bitterly, being lost again, province by province, as the tide of the long French war turned against the English at last. Edward was born, in other words, in the twilight of that empire, in a great foreign city held down by English arms, and the losing of those French lands, the squandering of his grandfather's glory, was even then one of the great grievances driving the discontent at home, the failure for which men blamed the feeble king and his grasping favourites. So the golden boy's very birthplace was bound up with the slow gathering of the storm. A child of the English Empire in France, born just as that empire was slipping away. And from the cradle he was raised as what he was, the heir, the eldest son of one of the greatest men in the kingdom, the boy on whom the whole future of a mighty house was understood to hang. There is a particular weight to the raising of such a child, an attention and an expectation that falls on the firstborn son of a mighty line, in a way it falls on no other child. And Cecily would have felt it and acted on it, watching this one with a special care, knowing that he was being shaped not merely to be a man, but to be the head of the house, the carrier of the name and the blood and the claim. He was given, as he grew, his own title and his own household, the trappings of his coming greatness, and he was trained in everything a great lord's heir must know, the management of men and lands, the arts of war, the courtesies and the policy of the high nobility, and he took to it all by every sign with an easy brilliance, growing into precisely the splendid figure his birth required, so that the hope his parents had pinned on him seemed, year by year, more and more gloriously fulfilled. He was the answer to all their ambitions, this boy, the living promise of the house's future, and his mother watched him grow with the fierce, proud, watchful love that a woman keeps for the child who carries everything. And he grew, by every account, into a youth who more than fulfilled the hope. He was tall, taller than almost any man of his age, golden-haired and strikingly handsome, strong and able and charming, with an easy warmth that drew people to him and a real gift for war and for the winning of men. He was the very picture of what a great lord's heir should be, and he must have seemed to his mother, in those bright early years, almost too good to be true. A son sent to crown all her labours. There is no mistaking the pride a mother takes in such a child, the golden firstborn son, who is everything the world admires. And Cecily had it in full measure. What she could not have known was how soon and how terribly the world would test him, nor how high it would lift him in the testing. For while Edward was still a very young man, barely 18, the long-gathering storm broke at last, and it broke first upon his father. The Duke of York, after years of quarrel and uneasy truce, made his bid at last for power and then for the crown itself, and it ended in disaster, on a bitter winter day at a place called Wakefield in the north. The Duke was defeated and killed, and with him died his second son, Edward's brother Edmund, a boy of 17. In a single afternoon, Cecily lost her husband and one of her sons, and the leadership of the whole shattered cause fell suddenly and totally upon the shoulders of her eldest boy, and the boy rose to it. Edward, not yet a man, gathered the broken forces of his house, marched, fought, and within a few months had done what his father never managed. He destroyed the rival army utterly in the most savage battle ever fought on English soil. A day of slaughter in a driving snowstorm that left tens of thousands dead, and he had himself proclaimed king. It is worth pausing on the sheer horror of that day, for nothing else in all these wars approached it, and it was on that field that the crown of her son was truly and finally won. Tens of thousands of men fought on a high bleak plateau through the whole of a short and bitter spring day, in a driving fall of snow that blew into the faces of one army and gave the other a cruel advantage. The two great hosts grinding against one another, hour after hour after hour, with no quarter asked or given. It was a fight to the death between the two halves of a divided nation, the longest and most stubborn and most murderous of all the battles of the age. And when at last the broken line gave way, the slaughter of the rout ran on for miles, the fleeing men cut down in their thousands, the snow trodden into red slush, the very rivers, it was said, choked with the dead and running with blood. The numbers who fell that day were never truly counted, but they were greater by far than in any other battle ever fought on English soil. A whole generation of men killed in a single winter day so that the House of York might hold the throne. Cecily was not there to see it, but she had sent her son to it and waited for the word, and the word, when it came, was victory. Crown secured, the rival house broken, all of it bought with the most terrible single day of killing the country had ever known. It was the foundation her son's kingship rested on, that red field in the snow, and she of all people understood what it had cost. For the price of it had been paid, in part, only weeks before, in the blood of her own husband and her own boy. So the golden boy became King Edward, the fourth of that name, and Cecily, who had so lately been a grieving widow with her cause in ruins, was now, astonishingly, the mother of the King of England. Picture the day they crowned him. For it was the answer to everything that had gone before, to the paper crown over the gate and the bodies in the snow. He was brought in state through the city to the great abbey, the tall golden youth at the centre of a slow river of lords and bishops and the high men of the realm. The streets thick with people, come to see the new young king who had risen out of the ruin of his house to seize the throne by his own courage. Within the ancient abbey, amid the candles and the incense and the deep rolling music, the holy oil was laid upon him, and the crown of England set upon his bright head, and the great men knelt to do him homage, and the heralds cried his style, and a boy not yet 19 was made the anointed king of the land. Somewhere in that gathering, or close to it, his mother, she had married a duke and borne him a dozen children, and buried half of them. She had been the wife of a man who reached for the crown and died for it, dishonoured. His head crowned with paper. And now she stood or sat and watched the oil and the gold laid upon the head of her own son. Watched the boy she had carried in a foreign city and raised at her own knee become the anointed sovereign of England, the highest thing a mortal could be. Whatever it had cost, and it had cost almost everything, she had this in that incense-heavy moment under the abbey's great vaults. The strange, dizzying glory of a mother watching her child be crowned a king. It is hard to think of a sharper turn of fortune from the pit to the summit in the space of a few months. And at the heart of it, her son, the tall golden boy she had raised, now a crowned king at not yet 19. For a mother, the pride of it must have been almost beyond bearing. The strange, fierce joy of seeing the child of your body lifted to the very highest place there is. She took her own state up accordingly, kept the style and the dignity of a king's mother, and for a while the House of York stood at the top of the world, and her golden son was the brightest thing in England. Whatever sorrows had gone before, and whatever was still to come, she had this, the rare and dizzying joy of being mother to a king. And she had it because that king was her own boy, raised at her knee, lifted to the throne by his own courage out of the ruin of his father's fall. But there was a flaw in Edward, and it showed itself early, and it would put the first great wound between mother and son. For all his gifts, the new king was a man of strong and careless appetites, easy-natured and pleasure-loving, and where the marriage of a king should have been a careful matter of state, the cementing of some great foreign alliance, Edward threw all such calculation to the winds. He fell for a beautiful widow of no royal blood at all, a woman named Elizabeth, of the Woodville family, gentry rather than nobility, and the widow of a man who had fought against his own house. And he married her in secret, for love or for desire, telling no one until the thing was done. The story of how it happened became one of the romances of the age, told and retold ever after. The young king, riding through the country, was met by a beautiful widow who came to plead for the lands her dead husband had forfeited, the husband who had fallen fighting against the king's own cause. She was some years older than the king, and a mother already, and far beneath him in every worldly way, but she was lovely, and she was clever, and she would not be his on any terms but marriage. And the king, who could have had almost any woman in Europe to wife, who was expected by every rule of statecraft to sell his hand for the highest foreign alliance, threw all of it away and married her secretly, quietly, in a private ceremony with almost no one present, and kept the marriage hidden for months while his counsellors went on negotiating, all unknowing, for a grand foreign bride. When at last he was forced to confess what he had done, to admit that the King of England had already bound himself to a portionless English widow for nothing but love, the shock of it ran through the whole court and the whole kingdom. It was unheard of, scandalous, a king marrying so far beneath him and so far outside all calculation of policy, and it made enemies for him that he would never wholly lose. But it was done, and a king's marriage could not be undone, and the beautiful widow was queen. For his mother, it was the bitterest of pills, the squandering of her son's greatest asset on a love match. She thought shameful, and the seed, as it proved, of a harvest of troubles that would in the end help to destroy everything. But for Edward, in that first flush of it, it was simply what he wanted, and Edward all his life took what he wanted, and the reckoning came later, as the reckoning for such things always does. To his mother, it was an outrage, a folly, a humiliation. She had expected him to make a marriage worthy of his crown, and instead he had bound himself to a portionless widow, with a swarm of grasping relatives, and not a drop of royal blood. The proud old Duchess was furious, and she did not trouble to hide it, and there are stories, perhaps true, perhaps not, of the bitter words that passed between them, of how she opposed the match with everything she had and could not stop it. It was the first true breach between Cecily and her golden son, and it cut deep, the prideful mother and the willful king. And though they were reconciled in time, in the way of families, the wound was real, and it marked the beginning of the troubles that the unworthy marriage would breed. To understand her fury, you must understand what the marriage of a king was supposed to be. It was the single most valuable card a kingdom held, a king's hand, reserved for the highest possible bargain, given to a foreign princess to seal a great alliance, to buy peace or friendship or wealth or land, the most important act of policy a king could perform. For Edward to throw that priceless card away, to marry not a princess of France or Burgundy, but a portionless English widow of no royal blood, the daughter of mere gentry and the relict of a man who had fought against his own house, was, in the cold eyes of statecraft, an act of reckless folly, a squandering of the realm's greatest asset for nothing but desire. And to a mother, as proud of her blood as Cecily, it was worse than folly. It was a kind of insult to everything she was, a debasing of the royal line she had suffered so much to raise up. She had borne and bled for the greatness of this house, had seen her husband and a son die for it, and now her surviving son, the king, had bound that hard-won greatness to a woman she thought far beneath it. The proud old Duchess did not hide her anger, and there are stories of the bitter scenes that passed between them, the mother raging, and the son immovable, the breach between them wide and raw. And her anger, whatever we make of it, proved horribly prophetic, for the marriage bred exactly the troubles she had feared. The new queen came trailing her whole tribe of relations, the grasping Woodvilles, gentry yesterday, and the king's kin today. And Edward raised them up, marriage by marriage and office by office, until they were everywhere, resented and despised by the old nobility, a swelling source of envy and bad blood at the very heart of the court. It was Woodville greed and Woodville pride that drove the mighty Warwick into rebellion. It was hatred of the Woodvilles that helped, in the end, to give Richard his opening to seize the throne and destroy the princes. The whole long catastrophe of the family's self-destruction can be traced in part back to that secret love match, and Cecily had seen the danger in it from the very first, had raged against it and been overruled, and now had to live through the slow vindication of watching every evil she had feared come true. Being right brought her no comfort at all, only the bitter knowledge that she had seen the cliff and been unable to turn her son away from it. For the new queen came with her whole tribe of relations, and the king, fond of his beautiful wife, raised them all up, marrying her sisters into the greatest houses, heaping honours on her brothers, until the upstart Woodvilles seemed to be everywhere, and the old nobility seethed with resentment of them. The mighty Earl of Warwick, the king's own cousin, and the man who had done more than anyone to put him on the throne, came to hate the Woodvilles and the king who favoured them. And the hatred drove him at last into open rebellion against the very king he had made. There followed years of turmoil, of risings and betrayals, in which Edward was for a time driven clean out of his kingdom and forced to flee overseas. A king in exile with nothing, while his enemies set the poor broken old King Henry back upon the throne for a strange brief interval. And through all of it Cecily watched and waited, as the mothers of that age always watched and waited, while her golden son's fortunes rose and fell and rose again, never knowing from one season to the next whether she would hear that he was triumphant or that he was dead. And he came back. Edward, like all the great survivors of that bloody age, would not stay down. For a strange interval, in the middle of his reign, everything had been turned upside down. The great Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, having failed with George, had turned his coat entirely, made peace with the old enemy, the French Queen and the broken king's party, and driven Edward clean out of the kingdom, a king with nothing. Fleeing overseas in a small ship with a handful of followers and not even the money to pay the sailors. And the poor gentle old King Henry, who had spent years a prisoner in the Tower, was brought blinking out of his cell and set back upon the throne he had never wanted, a holy ghost of a king restored to a crown he could not hold. It must have been for Cecily a vertiginous reversal, her triumphant son a penniless exile, the enemy she thought destroyed restored to power, everything she had suffered for thrown suddenly into doubt again, and she could only wait, as ever, for the wheel to turn once more. And turn it did, for Edward, like all the great fighters of that age, would not accept defeat. He gathered what friends and money he could abroad, landed back in England with a small force, gathered strength as he marched, and within a few short weeks had smashed his enemies utterly in two more terrible battles. On a foggy field, in the confusion of mist and treachery, the mighty Warwick himself was killed, the great kingmaker cut down at last. And soon after, in another bloody fight, the last hope of the rival house was destroyed, their young prince killed, their cause extinguished, and the gentle old King Henry, no longer of any use to anyone alive, was quietly murdered in the dark of the Tower the very night his son's death made him expendable. With those few savage weeks, the long wars seemed truly over, the rival house wiped out root and branch, and Edward sat secure at last, his throne built now upon a mountain of the dead. He returned from exile, gathered his friends, and in a matter of weeks smashed his enemies in two more terrible battles, killing the mighty Warwick on a foggy field and destroying the last hopes of the rival house in a slaughter that took the life of their young prince, and soon after, of the gentle old King Henry himself, quietly murdered in the dark of the Tower of London once his cause was dead. With that, the long wars seemed finally over. The rival house lay extinguished. Edward sat secure at last upon his throne, and there followed a stretch of real and welcome peace. A dozen years and more of calm, in which the kingdom healed and trade revived, and the king grew rich and popular, and, it must be said, unacquainted and idle for their appetites, that had once seemed only the high spirits of a young man hardened, with the years, into something heavier. These were, for the country, good years, the first real peace it had known in a generation, and it is worth resting in them a moment after so much blood. The king understood the value of trade as few kings before him, had courted the merchants, filled his treasury, kept the roads safe and the law running, and presided over a court of real brilliance and splendour. Edward loved magnificence, loved fine clothes and rich feasts and beautiful things, and his court became a place of dazzle and display, the king himself the most dazzling thing in it, tall and golden and gorgeously arrayed, the very image of a great king in his glory. It was a court built deliberately to impress, for Edward understood, as the cleverest kings always have, that the show of majesty was itself a kind of power, that men obeyed more readily a king who looked the part, who dazzled the eye and overawed the spirit with the sheer splendour of his state. And so he spent lavishly on the trappings of kingship, on cloth of gold and rich furs and jewels, on great feasts and ceremonies, on the building and beautifying of palaces, on everything that could make his court a wonder and his person the centre of it. He was helped in this by his own magnificent body, for he was the tallest man at his own court and one of the handsomest, and arrayed in his finery, he was a sight to stop the breath. The golden giant of a king who looked exactly as a king in a story ought to look. There was substance beneath the show too, for these were years of real prosperity, the king grown genuinely rich through his careful encouragement of trade, so that the splendour was not hollow display bought on credit, but the true overflow of a full treasury. For a dozen years and more, the court of the Golden King was one of the wonders of the kingdom, a place of beauty and plenty and ease after the long horror of the wars, and the people, who had bled so much, were glad of it, glad to have a king who looked like a king and kept the peace and made the country rich. It was, for all its faults, a real golden age, brief and bright between the darkness that came before and the darkness that came after, and Cecily lived through it as the mother of the Golden King at its centre. And whatever private griefs she carried, she had this to set against them, the sight of her son, secure and splendid and beloved, the house she had suffered for raised to its glittering height. For his mother, who kept her own state nearby as the king's mother, there must have been deep satisfaction in it. Whatever their private quarrels, the sight of her son, secure and splendid on his throne, The house she had suffered so much for raised to the very summit of the world. The long ordeal seemingly ended in triumph. She had borne him in a foreign city, in the twilight of one empire. She had seen him snatch a crown out of the ruin of his father's fall. And now she saw him reign, rich and feared and beloved, the master of England. And it must have seemed, in those calm, bright years, that all the suffering had been worth it after all. But the seeds of ruin were in the soil, even of those golden years, and they were of two kinds. The first was the resentment bred by the king's marriage, the swarm of upstart Woodville relations grown great on his favour, hated by the old nobility, a sour current running always beneath the bright surface, waiting. And the second was in the king himself, in the very appetites that made him so splendid. For the love of pleasure that had seemed, in the young man, only the overflow of a great vitality, curdled, in the years of ease, into something grosser and more dangerous. He ate and drank and loved to excess, gave himself wholly to the pleasures his power could buy, and his magnificent body paid the price, thickening and softening and failing. The golden athlete, who had won a crown at 18, become a bloated, ailing man in his 30s. He was burning himself out, though no one quite saw it, spending the strength that should have lasted him decades, and the bill, when it came due suddenly. He took a chill, or a fever, or simply collapsed under the weight of his own excess, and within days, at only 40 years of age, the Golden King was dead, leaving a child to inherit and a kingdom full of enemies ready to tear that child's inheritance apart. His mother outlived him. She had pinned the future of the house on this one, above all the others, and he had carried it gloriously, and then, through nothing but his own appetites, let it fall. Dying before his time, and leaving everything he had built to be destroyed within weeks of his passing. For this was the sad ending of the golden boy. The very qualities that had made him so dazzling, the ease and the charm and the boundless appetite for pleasure, betrayed him in the end. He grew gross and self-indulgent in his years of peace, eating and drinking and loving to excess, his fine body running to ruin, until the strong golden youth who had won a crown at 18 was a bloated, ailing man before he was 40. And then, quite suddenly, in the spring of a year when he was only 40, he sickened and died, worn out before his time by his own excess, leaving behind a kingdom and two small sons and a tangle of hatreds that would tear everything he had built to pieces within weeks of his death. Cecily outlived him. The golden firstborn, the son who had been her pride and her glory, the boy who had lifted the whole house to the summit and become a king, went down into the grave before his own mother, dead in early middle age of nothing nobler than his own appetites. She had borne him in a foreign city, raised him to greatness, quarrelled with him over his marriage, and made it up again, and now she buried him, the first of her crowned sons to die, and she can hardly have guessed, standing at his grave, that his death was not an ending, but the opening of the very worst chapter of all. Now we must turn back a little in time and go to the second of her sons, Edmund, for his was the first of the young lives the wars took, and his death is one of the wounds that never healed. He was born about a year after Edward in the same foreign city, and the two boys grew up as a matched pair, the elder sons of York. Close in age and close in everything, raised side by side and bound together in the deep wordless way of brothers near in years. Where Edward was the golden one, tall and dazzling, Edmund was the steady shadow at his side, a little younger, a little less remarked, but a fine and promising boy in his own right, given his own title and his own household as the second son of a great duke. The two of them were raised together as a pair, the elder sons, close enough in age to be near companions, and they did almost everything side by side. They were schooled together, drilled in arms together, sent together as boys to keep their own household in the marches of Wales, learning the business of lordship under the same tutors and officers. The golden elder brother and the steady younger one growing up as a matched and inseparable pair. There is a particular closeness in brothers raised so near in years and so much together, a bond of shared everything that needs no words. And Edward and Edmund had it, the two of them facing the world as a team. The heir and his second, the bright one and the loyal one. And so when they rode to war together, as they did at the last, they rode as they had always done everything, side by side. And the catastrophe that overtook them was a catastrophe of the pair. The father and the second son, killed together at Wakefield, while the elder, away on his own command, survived to carry on. One imagines what it was for Edward, the survivor, to lose in a single day his father and the brother who had been his shadow and companion all his life, and to know that he must now go on alone, must become in a moment the head of the house and the avenger of them both. He did go on, and he won the crown, and he avenged them. But the steady brother, who had stood at his side since the nursery was gone, and the place where Edmund should have stood, all through the long years of Edward's glory, the loyal younger brother, who would never have betrayed him as George did, was empty. Their mother knew the emptiness too, for she had raised the pair of them and watched them grow together, and she had to live with the one and grieve the other, the bright surviving king and the steady boy cut down at 17. The two she could no longer think of as a pair. We know less of him than of his famous brother, for he did not live long enough to write his story large upon the world, but we may see the two of them together in the mind's eye. The young sons of York learning their letters and their horsemanship and their arms, the pride of their father and the hope of their house, the elder boys to whom all the younger children looked up. And then, while he was still only 17, almost a boy, he went to the wars with his father, and he did not come back. It happened at Wakefield, on that bitter winter day, when the Duke of York, overconfident or outmanoeuvred, came out from the safety of his castle and was caught and overwhelmed by a much larger enemy force. The Duke was killed in the fighting, and young Edmund, caught up in the rout, trying to flee the field with the rest of the broken army, was overtaken. The story that comes down to us, which may be true or may have grown in the telling, is that he was caught upon a bridge as he tried to escape, a frightened boy among the fleeing men, and that he was recognized for the Duke's son, and that the man who took him, a hard lord of the rival party, whose own father had been killed by the Yorkists, would show him no mercy. There was a blood feud in it, the old terrible arithmetic of vengeance that drove this whole war, the killing of a son to repay the killing of a father, and so the boy was cut down. Killed in cold blood after the battle was already lost, a 17-year-old slaughtered, not in the heat of the fighting, but in the settling of a grudge. It is one of the cruelest images in the whole long story, the boy on the bridge, trapped and pleading, and the hard man with the knife, who would not be moved, and it has haunted the memory of these wars for 500 years. And we should remember, behind the image, the mother. For Cecily was not at Wakefield. She was far away, waiting, as she so often waited, for news. When the word came at last, up the long winter roads, that the battle was lost, that her husband was dead, and that her second son, her boy of 17, had been killed in the rout. In a single message, she learned that she had lost both the man she had been married to for 30 years and the second of the sons she had borne and raised. There is no preparing for such a thing, no possible readiness, and we are not told how she took it, for she kept her own counsel, as she always did. Try to feel the shape of that waiting, for it was the particular ordeal of the women of her kind, and Cecily knew it again and again across the long wars. The men rode off to the fighting, and the women stayed behind. In the castles and the great houses, to hold things together and to wait for news, and the waiting was its own kind of torment, perhaps the worst of all. For news moved slowly in that age, at the pace of a tired rider on a muddy winter road, and a woman might wait days, not knowing, while the thing had already been decided far away, and the men she loved were already living or already dead, and she could not know which. Picture her in those days after Wakefield, somewhere far to the south, knowing only that a battle was to be fought in the north, that her husband and her second son were in it. Every hoofbeat on the road outside the walls, a fresh stab of hope and dread, every traveller a possible bearer of the worst. And then the rider, at last, mud-spattered and grim, and the news he carried up from the frozen north. The battle lost. The Duke dead, the boy Edmund dead, the cause in ruins. She had no power over any of it. She could not have ridden to the field, could not have fought, could not have protected them. She could only wait, and then receive the unbearable word, and then somehow go on, and the manner of Edmund's death made it the bitterer. For there was in it the cold poison of the blood feud that drove this whole terrible war. The lord who killed the boy after the battle was not a stranger striking in the heat of combat. He was a man whose own father had been killed by the Yorkists at an earlier fight, and he killed Edmund by the story that has come down to us, deliberately and in cold blood, as vengeance, repaying the death of his father with the death of the Duke's son. This was the engine that drove the wars and made them so long and so merciless, this terrible arithmetic of revenge, each killing breeding the next, the sons of the slain growing up to slay in their turn. Vengeance answering vengeance down the years, until a whole generation of the nobility had been fed into the mill. Edmund was caught in that machinery, a boy of 17 cut down to settle a score that was none of his making, and his death in turn would be repaid, within the year, in the blood of the battle that won his brother the crown. So it went on, blood for blood, and at the heart of it, again and again, the mothers waiting for news, receiving the bodies of their sons, and burying them, and finding, somehow, the strength to go on. Cecily found it. She always found it. But the boy on the bridge was the first of her grown children to be fed into that mill, and a part of her, one feels certain, was buried with him in the cold northern ground. But we may be sure it broke something in her, even in that hard, strong heart, the killing of her 17-year-old boy on a bridge in the snow. It was the first of her children to be taken by the wars, and the manner of it, the cold murder of a frightened boy, made it the bitterer. The enemies of her house, not content with the killing, did a thing afterward that was meant as the final insult, and that became instead an undying emblem of their cruelty. They took the head of the dead Duke, her husband, and they set it up over the gate of the city of York, and upon it, in mockery of his reaching for the crown, they placed a paper crown, a worthless mock crown of paper, so that all who passed might see the would-be king brought low, and somewhere near him, very likely, the head of his murdered son. It was the lowest point to which the family had yet been brought. The husband and the second son, dead and dishonoured, their heads set up for the jeering of the crowd, the cause in ruins, everything lost. The paper crown is the detail that has never been forgotten, and it tells us, better than any chronicle, what kind of war this had become. To kill a man in battle was one thing, the common hard fortune of war that any soldier risked. But to take his severed head and set it high over the gate of the city that bore his own name, and crown it in mockery with a worthless circlet of paper, so that all who passed beneath might laugh at the would-be king brought low, was something else entirely, a deliberate cruelty, an insult meant to wound beyond death, to dishonour and degrade as well as to destroy. It was the language of a feud that had passed beyond ordinary war into something colder and more personal. A determination not merely to defeat the enemy, but to humiliate him, to grind his pride into the dust. And it was aimed, though those who did it perhaps did not think of her, straight at the heart of the proud woman who had been his wife. For there is hardly a crueler thing that could be done to a widow than to set her husband's head up for mockery and crown it with paper. When Cecily learned of it, as she surely did, the image of it must have burned itself into her forever. The head of the man she had been married to for 30 years, jeered at over the gate, dishonoured in the eyes of the world. And yet, as we have seen, the family answered that paper crown, in the end, with a crown of gold. For within the year, her eldest son had won the throne and could bring his father's and his brother's bones home at last to honourable burial and wash away the insult in the only coin that age understood, which was victory. But the memory of the paper crown remained, the emblem of the lowest hour, the moment the proud house was brought as low as it could go, and rose again. A mother could be forgiven for never rising from such a blow. But Cecily did rise, and more than rise, for it was out of this very pit that her eldest son Edward gathered the wreck of the cause and went on to win the crown within the year. So that the paper crown over the gate was answered, in the end, by a crown of gold upon the head of the dead boy's brother. The dead were avenged. But Edmund did not come back, and was not avenged into life. And the place where the steady second son should have stood, all through the years of his brother's glory, was empty, and his mother knew it, and felt it, every day of the long years she had still to live. Let us turn now to a quieter child, a daughter who made far less noise in the chronicles than her brothers and her famous sister, and yet who would prove, through her own children, to be the source of more trouble than almost any of them. Her name was Elizabeth, and she came among the middle children, between the elder boys and the younger ones. Of her girlhood we know little, for she was not the kind of daughter the records noticed, neither the eldest to be married first, nor the boldest to be remembered, but one of the quieter ones in the middle of a large brood. Growing up in the nursery and the schoolroom under her mother's exacting eye. In the way of her family and her rank, she was married, while still young, to a great nobleman, John de la Pole, the Duke of Suffolk, a steady man of high blood, and the match was a sound and a prosperous one. She became the Duchess of Suffolk, settled into the life of a great lady on her husband's wide estates, and there she did the thing that the women of that age were above all expected to do. She bore children, a whole brood of them, sons and daughters, and lived, by every sign, a long and a relatively peaceful life, far from the worst of the storms that destroyed so many of her kin. In her own person, then, Elizabeth was the fortunate one, or seemed so, the daughter who married well and lived long and was spared the violent ends that took so many of the others. There is something worth dwelling on in the very ordinariness of her good fortune, set against the wild fates of her brothers and sisters, for it shows us the life that a daughter of this house might have lived, had the times been gentler, and it throws the rest into sharp relief. While her brothers reached for crowns and died for them, Elizabeth lived the life a great lady was supposed to live. She ran her husband's households with the skill her mother had drilled into her. She bore her children and raised them, year after year, in the settled rhythm of a prosperous noblewoman's days, the management of estates, the keeping of hospitality, the round of the seasons, and the offices of the church. She was a duchess, rich and honoured, mistress of broad lands, the wife of a steady and a loyal man, who, unlike so many of the great lords of that age, contrived to keep his head down and his house safe through all the turning of fortune's wheel. It was, by the standards of her family, an almost miraculously peaceful existence, the kind of long, quiet, useful life that most people in any age would count a blessing. And that in her family was the rarest thing of all, and she had the length of years to match it, outliving the wars, outliving her brothers, outliving even her formidable mother, going at last to her own grave, full of years. A survivor of a vanished world, the quiet daughter who had simply, against all the odds of her blood, endured. And yet, as we have seen, the doom of the family found her in the end, not in her own person, but in her sons. And there is a deep and a terrible lesson in that, for it shows that the inheritance of this blood was not a thing one could escape by being quiet and careful and keeping out of the way. It was in the veins. Elizabeth had reached for nothing, plotted nothing, wanted nothing but her quiet, prosperous life, and yet she had given her sons the blood of York, the old royal claim, and that claim was a kind of slow poison that would draw them, one after another, out of their safe inheritance and toward their deaths, no matter what their mother wished. She could not protect them from it any more than she could have changed the blood in their bodies. The very thing that made them great, that made them nephews of kings and carriers of a royal line, was the thing that doomed them, and the quiet Duchess, who had been spared so much, was made at the last to drink the same cup as all her family, the cup of burying her children for the crime of their own greatness. She outlived nearly all her brothers and sisters. She outlived, indeed, her own mother, going to her grave only some years after Cecily herself had died. Of all the children, hers looks from the outside like the gentlest fate. A long, quiet life as a duchess, surrounded by her children, untouched by the headsman and the battlefield. But the quiet of her own life is only half the story. For the trouble in Elizabeth's life came not to her, but through her, through the sons she bore, and it was trouble of the deepest and most dangerous kind, for her sons carried in their veins the blood of the House of York. For when the wars at last came to their end, when the male line of her own family had been very nearly wiped out, when her brother Richard had fallen at Bosworth and the new Tudor king had taken the throne, it was Elizabeth's sons, the Delepole boys, who carried on the old Yorkist claim. They were nephews of two kings, grandsons of the great Duke, and in the eyes of those who still dreamed of a Yorkist restoration, they were the rightful heirs to a lost cause. The eldest of them, John, the Earl of Lincoln, had been a great favourite of his uncle Richard, even named, some said, as his heir to the throne. And when Richard was killed and the Tudors came in, this nephew would not accept it. He rose in rebellion against the new king, threw in his lot with a strange pretender, and was killed leading the Yorkist army at a hard-fought battle. Cut down in the field as his uncles had been before him, and he was not the last. Another of Elizabeth's sons would spend years in exile, plotting and intriguing against the Tudors, styling himself the rightful king, until he too was at last caught and put to death. The eldest of them, the one who fell first, had been the brightest hope of all, a young man of real ability, whom his uncle the king had loved and trusted, and some said even marked out as his own heir to the throne, since that uncle's own son had died. When the dynasty fell at Bosworth and the new king came in, this nephew could not bear it, could not accept that the crown of his house had passed to a stranger, and within a couple of years he had risen in arms. He gathered the scattered loyalists of the old cause, took ship for Ireland and then for England, with a force of foreign mercenaries and Irish levies at his back, and threw his lot in, with a boy who was paraded as a lost Prince of York. They met the new king's army on a field by a river, and it was a hard and a bloody fight, fiercer than the easy victory the king had expected, the desperate Yorkist remnant selling itself dearly. But it ended as these things ended, in defeat and slaughter, and Elizabeth's eldest son was cut down in the rout, dead in the field like his uncles before him, the first of the quiet Duchess's boys, to die for the doomed inheritance of his blood. And the others followed, in their turn, over the years that came after, one drawn into exile and intrigue and brought at last to the block, another fleeing abroad to become the final hope of the White Rose and dying at last in a foreign war. So the quiet daughter, who had reached for nothing, who had only married well and lived long and raised her children in peace, was made to give those children, one after another, to the same dark harvest that had taken all her family, the long, slow extinguishing of the line playing out through her sons after she and her mother were both in their graves. And a third, the youngest, fled abroad and lived for years as the last hope of the White Rose, the final Yorkist claimant, dreaming of an England that would call him home until he was killed at last in a foreign war. Far from the throne he never reached, and the male line of the great house guttered out at last in exile. So Elizabeth, the quiet daughter, the fortunate one who married well and lived long, became in the end the mother of the family's last desperate hopes and the last of its tragedies. Her sons, born to a peaceful duchess on her prosperous estates, were drawn one after another to their deaths by the doomed inheritance of their blood, by the old claim that would not die, until she had buried son after son to the Tudor axe and the foreign battlefield, the long, slow extinguishing of the line. There is a particular pity in her story, for she herself did nothing, reached for nothing, only lived her quiet life and raised her children, and yet through those children the curse of the family's greatness reached even her and took her sons one by one. Cecily did not live to see the worst of it, for the de la Pole tragedies played out mostly after her own death, but she lived long enough to see it begin. To see this quiet daughter's eldest boy ride out against the new king and die, and she would have understood, better than anyone, the terrible truth at the heart of Elizabeth's grief, which was the truth at the heart of her own, that to be born of this blood, this high and royal and fatal blood, was to carry a kind of doom in the veins, and that the mothers of such children, however quiet their own lives, were fated to bury them. And now to the boldest of the daughters, the one who flew highest and furthest of all the girls, and who, alone among the children, made herself a power in her own right in the wider world. Her name was Margaret, and she was, by every sign, the most formidable of Cecily's daughters, a tall, clever, strong-willed woman with a great deal of her mother in her, the kind of daughter a proud and able woman recognizes as her own flesh and spirit. She grew up among the middle children, a bright, fierce girl in the nursery, and as she came to womanhood, it was clear that here was a daughter who could be married very high indeed. For she had the looks and the wit and the bearing of a great lady, and she was the sister of a king. And married very high she was, in one of the most glittering matches in all of Europe. Her brother the king, in the days of his power, gave her hand to Charles, the Duke of Burgundy, the ruler of one of the richest and most splendid states in the Western world, a realm of wealthy cities and famous artists, and a court so magnificent that it was the envy of kings. To go from England as the bride of the Duke of Burgundy was to ascend to almost the highest place a woman of that age could reach short of a crowned queen, and Margaret carried it off in grand style. Sailing across the sea to a wedding of legendary splendour, days of feasting and pageantry the like of which had rarely been seen, and taking up her place as the Duchess of Burgundy, with all the force and dignity of her blood. She had no children of her own, as it turned out, but she became the devoted stepmother of her husband's daughter, the heiress of all Burgundy. And when her husband was killed in battle a few years into the marriage, Margaret did not fade into a quiet widowhood. It is worth seeing the world she went to, for it was one of the wonders of that age. The realm of Burgundy was not a kingdom, in name, but it was richer and more splendid than most kingdoms. A sprawling state that stretched across the wealthiest trading cities of the north, and its dukes kept a court so magnificent that it set the fashion for all of Europe, a court of cloth of gold and jewelled pageantry, of famous painters and musicians, of feasts and tournaments staged with a lavishness that left ambassadors gaping. To this dazzling world, Margaret came as a bride, the sister of the King of England, and her wedding was one of the legendary spectacles of the century. Days upon days of feasting and jousting and processions, the streets hung with tapestries, the tables groaning. The whole rich machinery of Burgundian splendour turned on full to welcome the English Duchess. She must have stepped into it like a woman stepping into a dream. This daughter of a war-torn island kingdom set down amid the greatest luxury in Christendom, and by every account she carried it with perfect command, a true daughter of York, proud and able and equal to any splendour, taking up her place among the princes of the continent as though she had been born to it, which, in a sense, she had, the wedding itself passed into legend, one of the great spectacles of that spectacle-loving age. It was held in the rich cities of the Burgundian north, and the festivities ran for days, a dazzle of pageantry such as the world had rarely seen. The streets hung with cloth and tapestry, the great squares filled with staged wonders and processions. Tournaments fought by knights in gilded armour before galleries of lords and ladies, in their finest feast after feast at tables laden with marvels of the cook's and the goldsmith's art, fountains running with wine, mechanical wonders and pageant castles, and every device that wealth and ingenuity could contrive. It was the Burgundian court showing the whole of Europe what it could do, and at the centre of it, the English bride, the sister of a king, carried through it all with the bearing of a great lady who would not be overawed by any magnificence, however vast. One imagines her moving through that golden tumult, grave and splendid, and entirely composed, a daughter of the proud house of York, taking the measure of the richest court in the world and finding herself its equal. For a girl who had grown up in the grim travelling castles of an island at war, it must have seemed like passing into another and a brighter world, and she did not blink, but took her place at the summit of it as though it were no more than her due, which, to a daughter of York, it was, and when her husband fell in battle, killed in one of the endless wars of that restless age, leaving the great inheritance to his young daughter, Margaret did not retreat. She made herself the rock on which the whole Burgundian house steadied itself, the wise and powerful dowager who guided her stepdaughter through the perils of a contested inheritance, who helped arrange the marriages and the alliances that kept the state intact, who became, over the years, one of the most respected and formidable figures in European affairs. She had no children of her body, but she mothered her husband's line as fiercely as if she had borne it herself, and she held her place for decades. A grand and undimmed presence at the heart of one of the most brilliant courts of the world. And she used her place, this childless duchess, not only for politics and intrigue, but for finer things, for she became one of the foremost patrons of her age, a lover of books and learning who lent her wealth and her name to the new arts that were just then transforming the world. It was an age of marvels in the making, when the new craft of printing was beginning to spread out of the German lands and change forever how knowledge moved among people. And Margaret, in her rich Burgundian court, was at the very heart of that ferment. She encouraged and supported the men who were bringing the printed book into the English-speaking world, took an interest in their work, lent her patronage to the making and the translating of books, so that her splendour was not merely the splendour of feasts and finery, but of mind and culture too. There was real substance in her, real intelligence, and real taste, the same quick, clever strength of mind that ran in her mother, and that she had carried across the sea and set to work in the service of art and learning as well as of power. So Margaret was not only the boldest and the most defiant of Cecily's children, but in some ways the most cultivated, a true Renaissance princess in the dawn of that new age, mistress of a brilliant court, patron of the book and the press, a woman who left her mark on the mind of Europe as well as on its politics. Of all the children, she flew not only highest but widest, her influence spreading out across the continent in ways the others tied to the narrow bloody quarrel of the English crown never managed, and her mother, had she fully known it, would have had reason to be proudest of all of this far-flung daughter who made herself great in the great world. For Cecily, watching from England, there can have been few prouder sights among all her children than this. The bold girl from the nursery grown into the great Duchess of Burgundy, holding her own among the mightiest princes of the age. The family's blood carried high and bright into the wider world by a daughter who feared nothing and bowed to no one. She stayed. She made herself the formidable matriarch of the Burgundian court, the protector of her stepdaughter and then of her stepdaughter's children, a shrewd and powerful figure at the centre of European affairs, respected and feared, a true daughter of York holding her own among the princes of the continent. For a mother, there must have been a particular pride in this daughter, the one who had risen so high and held it so well. The bold girl from the nursery become a sovereign duchess in a foreign land, mistress of one of the most brilliant courts in Christendom. And of all the children, Margaret was perhaps the one who escaped the family's doom most fully, for she was safely across the sea, established in her own power, when the worst of the storms broke over England and tore the rest of them down. She did not die on a battlefield or under the axe or in childbed. She lived long and grandly, and died at last in her own duchy, old and honoured, in her own bed. But she did not forget where she came from. And this is the part of her story that matters most for the family's long tragedy. For Margaret loved her house with a fierce, undying loyalty, and when that house fell, when her brothers were dead and the Tudor king sat on the English throne, she would not let the cause go. From her safe seat across the sea, the great Duchess of Burgundy became the bitterest and most dangerous enemy the new Tudor dynasty had, the tireless champion of every Yorkist hope, the patron and protector and paymaster of pretenders. When young men appeared, claiming to be lost princes of York, claiming the English crown, it was Margaret who took them up, who sheltered them and funded them, and lent them the weight of her name and her wealth, who sent them against the Tudor king with money and men at their backs. She backed one pretender and then another, the most famous of them, a young man who claimed to be one of the very princes who had vanished in the Tower, her own supposed nephew come back from the dead. And she championed his cause for years, a thorn in the Tudor side that would not be drawn. There was in this more than mere intrigue, for Margaret had made of her court a kind of gathering place for the scattered loyalties of the fallen house, a refuge across the water where the old cause could keep its flame alive. There is something both magnificent and heartbreaking in this long defiance of hers, the great Duchess across the sea, who simply would not accept that the cause was lost. Year after year, from her safe and wealthy seat, she gathered up the scattered hopes of the fallen house and breathed new life into them, taking in the exiles and the malcontents, the dreamers and the adventurers, anyone who would carry the white rose against the Tudor king. When a young man appeared, claiming to be the younger of the lost princes, claiming therefore to be the rightful king of England, Margaret took him up with all her formidable energy, acknowledged him as her nephew, schooled him in the ways of a prince, lent him money and men and the immense weight of her name and her wealth, and sent him to claim his throne. Whether she truly believed he was her nephew, or whether she knew him for an impostor and used him anyway as a weapon against the house she hated, we cannot now say, and perhaps she herself, in the strange country of grief and politics, hardly knew. But she championed him for years, and others before and after him, financing risings and invasions, keeping the Tudor king awake at night, refusing, with a stubbornness that was pure York, to let the old cause die its natural death. And it was in the end a hopeless thing, this long defiance, for the Tudors held and the pretenders fell, one after another, captured and exposed and put to death. And the white rose withered for all her watering of it. But there is a fierce nobility in the hopelessness, the old woman in her foreign palace, fighting on long after everyone else had given up, the last unbroken champion of a beaten house. And it is the truest expression of what ran in the blood of all of them, that refusal to yield, that pride that would rather fight a losing war forever than bow to the victor. Margaret was in this her mother's truest daughter, for Cecily too had that iron in her, that capacity to go on past all hope. The difference was only that Cecily turned her unbreakable spirit in the end toward God and endurance, while Margaret turned hers toward defiance and intrigue, the two of them fighting the same long sorrow in their different ways. The mother on her knees in her English chapel, and the daughter on her feet in her Burgundian court, both of them refusing, to the very last, to be broken by the ruin of their house. She never gave up. To the end of her long life, she went on plotting and hoping and stirring up trouble for the house that had supplanted hers, the last great defender of the White Rose, fighting from exile a war that was already lost. So Margaret was at once the most fortunate of the children, and the most unyielding, the one who got safely away to glory, and the one who, having got away, spent her freedom and her power trying to win back everything the rest of them had lost. Cecily would have followed her bold daughter's career from afar with a mother's pride and perhaps a mother's worry, for the splendour of the Burgundian match was a glory to the whole house, and the long defiance that came after was a brave and a hopeless thing. She did not live to see how it ended. The final failure of Margaret's pretenders, the last guttering of the cause. But she lived to see her daughter become a great duchess in a far country, and that, at least, among so many sorrows, was a triumph, a child lifted high and holding her place. The rose of Raby's own daughter become a rose of Burgundy, blooming bright and fierce in a foreign land long after the English garden had been laid waste. And now we come to the saddest and strangest of all her sons, the one whose ending men have told and retold for 500 years. The brother I promised you at the beginning of our evening. His name was George, and he was, from his earliest years, the charmer of the family, the boy with the looks and the easy grace and the winning ways. And as a child, it is easiest to spoil and hardest to deny. There seems to have been in George something that drew the eye and won the heart, and one suspects that his mother, like everyone else, found him hard to refuse. Certainly, in his later life, she would forgive him things that should have been long past forgiving, and one wonders whether the soft place she kept for him was not formed in the nursery, in the bright wilful boy who could charm his way out of anything. When his brother Edward became king, George was raised to the highest honours, made the Duke of Clarence, given vast estates, set second only to the king himself in the splendour of the realm. He had everything a man could reasonably want. The looks of his house, a great name, enormous wealth, and the love of the people who admired his golden Plantagenet beauty. And yet, it was never enough. There was, in George, a sickness of the spirit that no amount of getting could ever cure. And it is one of the saddest things in the whole story to watch it work in him. For he had been given so much and threw it all away, and one cannot help but wonder what wound in him drove it. Perhaps it was the simple curse of the second-born in a house where the firstborn had everything. The brother who stood always one step from the summit and could never, by any striving, mount it. Perhaps it was something deeper and stranger, a true instability of the mind, for his behaviour in his later years passed beyond mere ambition into something close to madness, a wild, suspicious violence, a conviction of plots and poisonings, a lawless arrogance that no king could have tolerated. He grew, men said, ever harder to manage, ever stranger, drinking heavily, brooding, lashing out, lurching from one folly to the next, as though some engine in him would not let him rest until it had destroyed him. The charm that had carried him so easily in his youth soured into something darker. The bright, willful boy of the nursery became a dangerous, unhappy man, a danger to everyone around him, and most of all to himself, and watching the slow unravelling of him must have been, for those who loved him, like watching a man walk slowly and deliberately toward a cliff, and being unable to call him back. And his mother loved him, that is the heart of it, loved him perhaps, with the particular helpless tenderness that mothers so often keep for the difficult child, the one who breaks their heart again and again and is forgiven again and again. We have the picture of her pleading for his life at the end, and it is the most human thing in the whole story. But we should see that it was not a single act, but the last of a long pattern, for Cecily had surely been forgiving George and worrying over George and trying to save George from himself for years before the end, as mothers do with such children. There is no harder love than the love for the child who will not be saved, who takes every kindness and every chance and squanders it, who seems almost to court his own destruction, and yet who is still your child. Still the bright boy you bore and held, still loved past all reason, precisely because he needs the love so badly and deserves it so little. Cecily knew that love, and it was tested in her to the very limit by George, and it failed at last, not because she stopped loving him, but because the world would not be moved. And the willful boy went down at last into the dark his own nature had dug for him, and his mother had to let him go. For there was a flaw in George that no fortune could ever fill, a restless, envious, unstable hunger that turned every gift to ashes and every kindness to fresh resentment. He could not bear that his elder brother had more, that Edward was the king and he was only the king's brother, that he stood always in the second place and could never, by any contriving, reach the first. It curdled in him into something poisonous, and it drove him from folly to folly. He fell under the influence of the mighty Earl of Warwick, the king's great enemy, married Warwick's elder daughter against his brother's wishes, and joined the Earl in open rebellion against the very brother who had given him everything. The Earl of Warwick was the greatest subject in the kingdom, a man so rich and so powerful and so skilled at the making and unmaking of kings that men would remember him ever after as the kingmaker, and he had been, for years, the chief prop of the House of York, the man who more than any other had set Edward on the throne. But Edward, grown into his kingship, would no longer be led, and above all, he would not let Warwick rule him, and the breach between the king and the great earl who had made him widened into hatred, sharpened by the rise of the upstart Woodvilles, who had stolen the marriages and the favour Warwick wanted for his own, and George, the restless second brother, eaten with envy of the king, was exactly the tool that Warwick needed. The Earl had 2 daughters and no sons, 2 of the greatest heiresses in England, and he offered the elder of them, Isabel, to George, along with the dream of a crown. For Warwick meant to pull Edward down and set George up in his place, a king he could manage. George took the bait. He married Warwick's daughter in defiance of his brother the king, and threw in his lot with the great rebel, and turned his coat against his own blood. For their mother, this was a fresh kind of grief, different from the clean sorrow of a child killed by the enemy, for here was a child making himself an enemy, a son turning traitor against his own brother, the family beginning to tear at itself. She had lost a husband and a son to the swords of the rival house, and borne it. But now she had to watch one living son take up arms against another living son. The thing she had borne them all to prevent, the House of York, at war with itself. The rebellion would fail, and George would come crawling back, and Edward, in the great mercy that was the other face of this family's fierce blood, would forgive him. But the pattern was set now. The deadly pattern of brother against brother that would run through everything that followed, and Cecily, who loved them both, was caught forever in the middle of it, the mother of the king and the mother of the traitor, able to do nothing but watch and grieve, and hope that the bonds of blood would hold them back from the worst. They did not, in the end. But that final horror was still to come, and for now there was only the bitter spectacle of her sons divided, and the long, anxious waiting to see whether they would tear the house apart or be reconciled. For a time he was a traitor in arms against his own king and his own blood, dreaming, it seems, of taking the throne for himself. The rebellion failed, and here is the first great mercy of George's story, and the first sign of the bond of blood that ran beneath all the family's quarrels. For Edward, the wronged king, forgave him. When the rising collapsed and George came crawling back, the king took his treacherous brother into his arms again, pardoned him, restored him to his honours and his estates, set him back among the great men of the realm as though nothing had happened. It is a striking thing, that forgiveness. The king embracing the brother who had taken up arms against him. And it tells us how strong the tie of family was, even in that murderous age. But it tells us, too, how deep the flaw in George ran. For the forgiveness did not mend him. It only covered the crack over, and in time the crack opened again, for George could not be still. In the years of peace that followed, he grew ever wilder and stranger, and more impossible. His wife died, and he convinced himself, against all reason, that she had been poisoned. And he seized a woman, he blamed, and had her put to death, with no lawful trial at all. A piece of lordly murder that no king on earth could overlook. He behaved with a lawless arrogance that grew more reckless by the year. He dabbled, men whispered, in fresh treasons and dark plots. The marriage that had drawn him into Warwick's orbit ended in its own small tragedy, for the wife he had taken, the elder daughter of the great Earl, died young, worn out by childbearing, as so many women were, leaving George a widower with his hold on her vast inheritance suddenly in question. And it was after her death that his behaviour passed beyond mere ambition into something close to madness. He convinced himself, against all reason and all evidence, that his wife had been poisoned, murdered by some enemy, and in his grief and his fury he seized a woman of her household whom he chose to blame, dragged her before a court he had overawed, and had her hanged with no lawful trial worthy of the name. A piece of naked lordly murder, done in open defiance of the king's justice. It was the act of a man who had ceased to believe that any law applied to him, who in his instability and his arrogance had come to think he could kill whom he pleased, and no king on earth could let such a thing pass. For if the king's own brother could seize and hang whomever he liked, then the king's justice meant nothing, and the whole order of the realm was mocked. It was more than any single treason, the thing that doomed George at last. The proof that he had become not merely a nuisance, but a danger to the very rule of law, a man who must be stopped before his lawless violence pulled everything down. And so the long patience of the king, his brother, stretched to breaking by years of treason and forgiveness and fresh treason, finally snapped, and George was arrested, and this time there would be no third pardon. His mother's pleading could not save him now, for he had passed beyond what even a king could overlook, and the strange dark end in the tower was waiting for him. He seemed bent, almost, on his own destruction, as though the restless hunger in him could find no rest until it had pulled the whole house down on his head. And at last he went too far, and the king his brother, who had forgiven him twice, would not, or could not, forgive him a third time. George was arrested, charged with treason, and condemned to death by the will of the king, his own brother, in a quarrel that had become past all mending. And so we come to the strange dark ending that has fixed George forever in the memory of England. He was not beheaded in public on the open scaffold, as a condemned nobleman usually was. He was put to death privately, secretly, within the walls of the Tower of London, and the manner of it, according to the story that has come down to us, was unlike any other execution in our history. That grim fortress by the river runs like a dark thread through this whole family's story, and it is worth seeing it for itself, for so much of their sorrow happened within its walls. The Tower of London was many things at once, as it had been for centuries, a royal palace where kings lodged in splendour before their coronations, a stronghold guarding the river approach to the city, a treasury and an armoury and a menagerie, and also, always, a prison, the place where the great and the fallen were held, and sometimes, quietly killed. Its high pale walls, and its broad cold moat, and the dark water gate, where prisoners were brought in by boat, made it a place of dread, even in an age used to dread, a place from which men did not always come out alive. The gentle old King Henry had been held there for years, and murdered there in the end, in the little chapel where he was at his prayers, or so the story went. George would die there, drowned in his wine within those same walls, and the two small princes, the lost boys, would be lodged there by their uncle and vanish there into the dark, never to be seen again. Three of the darkest deeds in the whole story: the killing of the old king, the killing of the brother, and the vanishing of the children, all done behind those same high walls, by the same quiet water, in the heart of the same grim fortress. For Cecily, the tower must have come to seem a place that swallowed her family, the dark mouth into which her kin disappeared. The old king and her son and her grandsons all taken into it and not given back. It stands by the river still, the same pale walls, the same cold water, keeping its secrets. The stones that saw the worst of what this family did to itself. He was drowned, it was said, in a great barrel of sweet wine, of Malmsey, the rich dark wine he was supposed to have loved, plunged headfirst into the cask and held there until he was dead. Whether it happened exactly so we cannot now know for certain, but the tale took hold at once and has never let go. The brother of the king drowned in a butt of wine in the tower, and it is true or not, a fitting strange end for so strange and self-destroying a life. Think what it meant. That secret killing in the tower, beyond the strangeness of the manner of it, it meant that the House of York had crossed a line it could never step back over, the line between quarrelling and kinslaying, the killing of brother by brother. There is no older or darker crime in all the stories of mankind than that one. The brother's hand turned against the brother, and the House of York had now committed it, openly, by the will of the king, against one of its own. It was the beginning of the end, though no one quite saw it yet, the first time the family turned its violence inward upon itself, instead of outward upon its enemies. And once that line was crossed, the rest followed with a terrible logic. Brother set against the children of brother, uncle against nephew, the whole house devouring itself from within until there was nothing left. George's death in his barrel of wine was the hinge on which the family's fortunes turned from triumph toward ruin, the moment the white rose began to feed upon itself. And there is a deeper thing still beneath the strangeness of it, which is what such a killing did to the soul of the woman who had borne both the man who ordered it and the man who suffered it. To carry, ever after, the knowledge that one of your children had compassed the death of another, that your own sons had turned on each other to the death, is a weight that no faith and no endurance can ever quite lift. A wound that does not close because the thing that made it can never be undone. She had to live with it through all her remaining years, the proud old woman who had failed, for all her pleading, to keep her children from each other's throats. And it was perhaps the bitterest of all the bitter cups she was made to drink, for it was poured by her own blood. For her own blood, in the cruelest betrayal of everything a family is meant to be. Now think of the mother, for Cecily was still living through all of this, and George was her son, and Edward was her son. And what was being done was the killing of one of her children by another, the deepest and most unnatural wound that can be dealt to a mother's heart. We are told, and it has the ring of truth, that she pleaded for him, that the old Duchess begged her royal son to spare his condemned brother, to find some other way, to let George live. It is the most human thing in the whole story. The mother on her knees before one son, begging for the life of another, refusing to give up on the willful boy who had broken her heart so many times before. And she failed. The king would not be moved, and George died in his barrel of wine, and Cecily had to live with the knowledge that one of her sons had ordered the death of another, that her own children had turned upon each other to the death, and that she had not been able to stop it. There is no grief quite like it, to lose a child not to the enemy, but to his own brother, to your own other child, and Cecily drank that bitter cup to the dregs. The charming boy from the nursery, the one she had always found it hardest to refuse, was dead by his brother's word, and the House of York had begun in earnest to devour its own. And so at last we come to the youngest, the final child, the small dark boy at the foot of the brood, whose story is the longest shadow of them all. His name was Richard, and there is a special tenderness reserved very often for the baby of a large family, the last child, the one whose growing the mother knows will be the last she sees. He was, by the accounts that come down to us, a small and slight and dark child, the least robust in body of all her sons. Dark where his brothers were fair, slight where they were tall, so that one imagines him as the frail and watchful little one in the shadow of a brood of big golden siblings, the child a mother worries over and guards a little more closely than the rest. And guard him she had cause to, for he was born into the very worst of the wars, a small boy, when his father and brother were killed at Wakefield. And in the dangerous days after that disaster, he and his brother George were sent away across the sea for safety, two small boys hurried out of a falling kingdom to keep them from the enemy's hands. Think of that, for a moment, from the mother's side, for it tells us much about the bond between Cecily and this youngest son. When the news of Wakefield came, when her husband and her second boy lay dead, and the enemy was triumphant, and the whole cause seemed lost, she had her two youngest children still with her, George and small Richard, and they were in deadly danger. For the victorious enemy might do anything to the sons of the man they had just destroyed. And so she did what a mother in such a moment does. She sent them away, across the sea, out of reach, hurried them out of the falling kingdom to the safety of a foreign court, choosing the pain of parting from her small ones over the greater terror of what might happen to them if they stayed. It was an act of fierce maternal protection in the worst hour of her life, the grieving widow saving the children she had left, even as she absorbed the loss of the ones she had lost, and the small dark Richard owed his life, very likely, to his mother's quick, hard decision in that terrible moment. There is a thread that runs from that act all the way to the end of his story. The bond between the mother who saved her youngest from the wreck of the family and the son who grew up to be her steadiest comfort, and then, at the last, the author of its darkest deed. She had saved him as a small boy. She had perhaps loved him, the frail last child, with a particular protective tenderness ever after. And she lived to see what he became, and to lose him too. The last of all of them, slain in a field with a crown on his head, the child she had once carried out of danger, gone at last into the danger she could not save him from. So the youngest began his life already in flight, already in danger, the frail last child of a family at war. He survived this small dark boy, where so many stronger seeming children did not, and he grew up, in the years of his brother Edward's reign, into a capable and an intensely loyal man, the steadiest and most dependable of all the brothers. While George schemed and betrayed, Richard stayed true. The king sent him north to govern the wild country beyond the Trent, and there the youngest son made himself, by all accounts, an excellent lord, a fair and a vigorous ruler who kept good order, did justice between great and small, defended the border, and won the genuine love of the hard northern people, who were not easily won. For most of his life, the small dark youngest was the good son, the loyal brother, the just governor, a man with as fine a reputation as any in the kingdom. It is one of the strange knots of this whole story that the son who would end as its darkest figure spent the long years of his brother's reign building a reputation as clean as any man's in England. And we should sit with that a moment, for it is the very key to the puzzle of him. He was no monster in those years by any account that survives, but the opposite, a model of exactly the virtues his age most prized, so that nothing in the loyal, capable man of the North foretold the deed that would brand his name forever. That is the riddle at the heart of him, how the good Lord became the Dark King. And it is why the love the northern country bore him matters so much. The city of York in particular kept a place for him in its heart to the very end, setting down in its records, even after his fall, a blunt northern grief for the king who had been good to them. There is something very moving in that, and worth dwelling on. For it is the testimony not of flatterers or courtiers, but of plain, hard northern townsmen who had nothing to gain by it. When the news came that the king was dead at Bosworth and a new dynasty had taken the throne, the safe and politic thing for any town to do was to forget him quickly and praise the victor, and most of the kingdom did exactly that. But the men of York, at the very moment of his fall, with his enemies now in power, and nothing to be gained, and much to be risked by loyalty to a dead and beaten king, set it down plainly in their official record that their king had been cruelly murdered, to the great heaviness of the city. It was a brave and an honest thing to write in that dangerous moment, and it is the truest tribute the small dark youngest son ever received, the unbought grief of the hard northern people he had governed well. Whatever he became at the end, whatever darkness gathered around his name over the matter of the crown and the children, those people who had actually lived under his rule, who had known him not as the wicked uncle of legend, but as their just and vigorous lord, remembered him with love, and said so, when saying so cost them something. It is a reminder that the man was more than the single terrible deed that fixed his name in infamy, that there had been a good lord there once, a faithful brother and a just governor loved by those he ruled, and that the tragedy of Richard was precisely that such a man should have been the one to do such a thing. His mother, one feels, would have understood that double truth better than anyone, for she had known the good son before the world knew the Dark King, had raised the loyal boy who became the man the Northerners mourned. And she had to hold both of them in her heart at once, the good son and the terrible deed, as mothers so often must. This is the part of Richard that makes the rest so hard to fathom, for the man who would seize a crown across the bodies of children was also, on all the evidence of those northern years, a capable and a conscientious and a genuinely loved ruler, no monster in any simple sense, but a good lord who did, at the last, a terrible thing. And he was loyal too, fiercely and conspicuously loyal. In an age when loyalty was the rarest of virtues, the one brother of the three who never wavered. While George schemed and betrayed, and was forgiven and schemed again, Richard stood like a rock beside the king, served him faithfully through every crisis, asked for nothing but the chance to serve, and got, in return, his brother's complete trust and the great power in the north that he wielded so well. If he had died in his brother's lifetime, while that loyalty was still whole and unbroken, he would be remembered, if at all, as a model of the virtues his age most prized, the faithful brother the just governor, the good lord of the north. His mother, watching her sons across those years, would have seen in this youngest one her steadiest comfort, the dependable one, the one who gave her no grief, and she could not have dreamed, watching him serve his brother so truly, what the death of that brother would unlock in him. If he had died then, in his brother's reign, he would be remembered, if at all, as a model of loyalty and good lordship, the faithful younger brother who served his king and ruled his province well. But he did not die then. He lived to face the great temptation, and the great temptation broke him, as it might have broken almost anyone. For when his brother, the king, died suddenly, worn out before his time, he left behind only two small sons, boys of 12 and 9, to inherit a throne in a kingdom, still seething with old hatreds, with the resented Woodville relatives of the boy's mother grasping for control, and Richard, the loyal uncle, named protector of the young king, his nephew, did a thing that has been argued over ever since and never settled. He seized the boys. He took the elder, the new little king, out of the hands of the Woodvilles. And then he took the younger too, and he lodged them both in the royal apartments of the Tower of London, and then, step, by a series of swift and ruthless strokes, he set them aside altogether. He had them declared illegitimate, unfit to reign, on an argument about their father's marriage that may have been true or may have been invented for the purpose. He took the crown himself. And the two boys, the little king and his brother, were seen less and less about the tower, and then not at all, and they were never seen again. And what became of them, no one has ever certainly known from that day. To this is the darkest matter in all the long dark story of this family, and we will not pretend to settle it tonight. For the wisest heads have argued it for 500 years and reached no agreements. Some have held that he was a cold villain from the first, a man who had always meant to have the crown and seized his moment the instant his brother was cold. Others have held that he was a loyal man, driven to desperate measures by real fear, convinced that the grasping Woodville relatives of the young king meant to destroy him the moment they had power, and that he struck first to save his own life and found, having struck, that he could not stop short of the throne. Still others have laboured to clear him of the worst of it altogether, to argue that the boys were not murdered at all, or were killed by some other hand. The truth is lost, buried with the boys themselves, and we will not find it tonight, nor do we need to. What matters for our story is simpler and sadder than the great historical riddle. It is that two small boys, a child of 12 and a child of 9, were lodged in the tower by their uncle, were seen less and less, and then were seen no more, and that their uncle wore the crown that had been the elder boy's by right. Whatever the truth of how they died, they were swallowed up in the dark while in his keeping, and the shadow of it has lain over his name for 500 years, and will lie over it, most likely, but come back. For a moment, from the great matter of crowns and guilt, to the simple grief at the centre of it, the grief that is our true subject tonight. For those two boys were not only princes and pieces in a deadly game, they were children, and they were Cecily's grandchildren, the sons of her own golden Edward, her blood twice over. She had very likely held them as babies. She had watched them grow as the bright hope of the house, the little princes who were to carry the line forward into the future. And now they were gone, vanished into the shadows of the tower. And the man whose hand most of the world saw in their vanishing was her own youngest son, their uncle, the small dark boy she had once sent across the sea as a child to keep him safe. Set yourself in her place. If you can bear to, an old woman who has already buried so much, now made to lose two small grandsons into the dark, and to know, or to fear, that the one who took them was her own last living son. There is hardly a crueler lot to imagine, the mother and grandmother of both the lost children and the man accused of losing them, her blood on every side of the wound, with no one to hate, and no one to comfort, and nowhere to lay the grief. We are not told what she felt, for she kept her silence to the end. The proud silence drawn close about her like a cloak. But the House of York was eating its own children now, and she sat at the very centre of the feast, and bore it as she bore all things, alone. Whether Richard had the boys killed, whether they died some other way, whether they were smuggled out alive, the truth lies buried beyond our reach. In his own time, the disappearance of the boys was not loudly spoken of at first. For who would dare to ask aloud what had become of the children when their uncle wore the crown and the whole court took its cue from him? But the silence itself was terrible, and the rumours grew in it like things in the dark. Whispered from mouth to mouth that the princes were dead, that they had been smothered in their beds by their uncle's order, that the tower had swallowed them. The whispers spread and would not be stopped, and they did Richard enormous harm. For even in that hardened age, the killing of children, and royal children, and his own brother's children, was a thing that turned the stomach and lost him hearts. He could not afford to lose. Men who might have accepted his seizure of the throne as the hard necessity of dangerous times could not stomach the murder of the babes. And the suspicion of it ate at his support, drove old allies into the arms of his enemies, and helped, in the end, to bring him down at Bosworth. Whether he was guilty, in fact, we will never know for certain. But he was held guilty in the court of common belief, then and ever after, and he never cleared himself, never produced the boys alive to silence the rumours, as he surely would have done if he could. And so the shadow settled on his name and never lifted, and the two small princes passed into legend as the murdered innocents of the tower, and their uncle into legend as the wicked king who killed them. For their grandmother, who outlived the whole grim business, there was no legend and no riddle, only the simple, unbearable fact that her grandsons were gone and her last son was blamed, and that she could do nothing about either and must carry both. The loss and the shame of it, unspoken, into her own grave. Richard's reign as king was short, and it was uneasy, for the manner of his taking of the crown had shocked many, even in that hardened age, and his throne never sat secure beneath him. And across the sea, the last hope of the rival house, a man named Henry Tudor, with a thin and roundabout claim of his own, gathered his friends and his foreign soldiers, and made ready to come and try the matter in arms. He landed. He marched, and on a summer morning, in a field in the middle of England, near a town called Bosworth, the last of Cecily's sons rode out to defend the crown he had seized. It was a strange and a treacherous battle, in which some of Richard's own great men sat still and watched, or went over to the enemy at the last, so that the king found himself, in the end, betrayed and outnumbered on the field. And Richard, whatever else may be said of him, did not run. Picture that last morning, the summer field in the heart of England, the two armies drawn up in the early light, and the king who had so much to answer for and so little left to lose. He had been betrayed, or feared he had, by great men who sat their horses on the edges of the field and would not commit, waiting to see which way the day would go before they chose a side. He was outnumbered and uncertain of his own men, and he must have known, as the morning wore on, that the battle was slipping away from him. And then he saw his rival, the Tudor, across the press of the field, lightly guarded, almost within reach, and he made his choice, the choice that has fixed him in memory ever since. For whatever else may be said of Richard, and much may be said, he did not flinch from the end. He gathered his household knights about him, the men who would die with him, and he put down his head and charged straight across the open field at his enemy. A last desperate gamble to settle the whole quarrel with one stroke of his own hand. He cut his way deep into the enemy ranks. Deep enough, they said, to come within a sword's length of the Tudor himself, killing as he went, the small dark man fighting like something cornered and savage. And then the betraying lords on the edge of the field came down at last on the other side, and he was surrounded and overwhelmed and hacked from his horse and killed, fighting to the last with the golden circlet of England bound about his helmet. So the youngest of Cecily's sons was dead, the frail dark baby of the brood grown to be the last king of his line and the last Plantagenet to rule. His broken body was stripped and slung across a horse and carried off in dishonour to be shown to the jeering crowds. A king who had worn a crown into battle that morning and was a naked corpse by afternoon, and a new dynasty took the throne of England on that summer day, and the long wars were over at last, and the House of York, after all its glory and all its blood, was finished forever. And far to the south, in her quiet house, the old woman received the news. The last of her sons was dead. The house she had given her life to build, the House of York, was finished forever. Every one of her boys was gone now. The golden Edward worn out in his bed, the steady Edmund cut down at 17, the charming George drowned in his wine, and now the small dark Richard slain in a field with a crown on his head. She had borne them all, and raised them all, and loved them all, in her hard, fierce way, and she had outlived every one. The youngest, the frail last child she had perhaps guarded most tenderly of all, the one she had sent across the sea as a small boy to keep him safe, had grown up to reach for a crown and lose everything. And now he too was gone, the last of them, and she was alone. So now we have met them all, her children, every one, and followed each to the end of the road, and we come back, as we must, to the woman by the fire, for she outlived them all and had to carry, alone, the memory of every one. Let us sit with her a while in those last years, for they were strange and quiet years, and they tell us, perhaps, more about who she truly was than all the crowns and the killings put together. When the last of her sons fell at Bosworth and the new dynasty came in, Cecily was already a very old woman, far older than most people of that age ever lived to be. And she had nothing left to fight for, and no one left to fight for it. Her husband was 40 years dead. Her sons were all in their graves. Her cause was finished, her house supplanted. The white rose pulled down, and a new flower planted in its place. A lesser spirit might simply have broken, might have sunk into bitterness or despair, an old woman with nothing left but grief. But that was not Cecily's way. Instead, in her last years, she did a remarkable thing. She turned the whole of her remaining life toward God, ordering her days with the strict devotion of a nun, so that her great house became something very like a religious house, and she herself something very like a holy woman. We actually know, from a document that has survived, how she spent her days in those final years, and it is a moving thing to read. She rose very early in the small dark hours for the first prayers of the day. She heard service after service, attended Mass, had holy books read aloud to her at her meals, the lives of the saints and the writings of the great mystics, so that even her eating was wrapped in devotion. She prayed through the offices of the day as the religious did, the whole long ladder of prayer from before dawn to after dark, and she ended each day, late, with the last prayers before sleep. It was the life of a vowess, a great lady who had taken vows of chastity and devotion in her widowhood. And Cecily lived it with the same exacting discipline she had once brought to the running of her households and the raising of her children. Picture the stillness of those days after so much storm, for it is a peaceful thing to rest in. The grand business of the world, the politics and the ambition and the endless striving that had filled her younger years, all of it was set aside now, laid down like a heavy burden at last put off. And in its place was only the quiet, the slow, prayerful round of a holy old age, the proud Duchess become almost a nun within the walls of her own house. There is a deep rightness in that turning. The haughtiest woman in England, spending her last strength on her knees in the dark, and we will come in a moment to what it truly meant. But first, simply see her there, at rest at the end of everything. The storm all blown out, the house gone silent, the old hands folded over the worn small book. And there is something deeply fitting in it, that this woman who had lived through the very worst that fortune could do, who had been lifted to the heights and cast into the depths and made to bury almost everyone she loved, should end her days in this deep stillness, on her knees, in the company of God and her own vast memory. It was not a defeat, this turning toward heaven, but a kind of victory, the last and quietest of her victories, for it was the act of a soul that would not be broken, that having lost the whole world it had fought for, turned and possessed itself in God and in patience. She had been proudest, the haughtiest woman in England, the mother of kings, the keeper of a queenly state. And she was, at the end, simply an old woman at prayer in the dark before the dawn, ready, waiting, her affairs in order, and her soul prepared, holding within her the whole vanished world that only she could still remember, and holding it up, day after day, in the long patient offering of her prayers. The proud Duchess, the mother of kings, the woman who had kept the state of a queen, spent the close of her long life on her knees, in the dim of the chapel, in the company of God and her own vast memory. And what a memory it was! Picture her there in the chapel, or by the fire in the evening, with her book of hours in her hands, an old woman alone with the longest memory in England. She could remember a world that no one else alive could remember. She could remember being a girl in the cold northern castles before any of it began. She could remember her young husband and the early years of their marriage, and the births of all those children in the curtained chamber, the living and the lost. She could remember the day the news came from Wakefield, and the day her golden son was crowned, and every triumph and every disaster of the long wars, for she had lived through the whole of it, the only one left who had. And she could remember her children, all of them, not as the kings and dukes and duchesses the chronicles record, but as her children, the babies she had nursed, and the small ones she had buried, and the grown ones she had loved and quarrelled with and lost. This is the thing about a mother that no history book can hold, and it is worth ending on, for it is the truest thing of all. To the world, her children were great figures, kings and queens and dukes and duchesses, players in the high drama of a kingdom, names in the long record of crowns won and lost. But to her, they were never that, or never only that. To her, Edward was not first of all a king, but the golden baby she had borne in a foreign city and watched grow tall. Edmund was not a casualty of a battle, but the steady boy who had stood at his brother's side since the nursery. George was not a traitor, drowned in wine, but the charming child she could never quite refuse. Richard was not the wicked uncle of legend, but the frail, small last son she had carried out of danger, and loved with a particular protective tenderness. She knew them as no one else ever could or ever would, knew them from before they were anyone. From the first cry in the curtained room, knew the children inside the great figures, the real human souls behind the names. And now they were all gone, everyone, and she was the last keeper of those true small memories. The only person left alive who remembered Edward as a baby, and Edmund as a boy, and the lost infants at all. And when she died, those memories would die with her, the children behind the kings, vanishing forever into the dark. That is the deepest grief of outliving everyone, deeper even than the loss itself. To be the last holder of a whole vanished world of small true things, and to know that when you go, it goes, and no one will ever again remember the children as their mother remembered them. She held them, all of them, to the very end, in the only place they still lived, which was her own heart, and she carried them with her, at the last, into the quiet, where the long account was finally closed. All those faces, gone now, every one, living again only in the memory of the old woman by the fire, until she too should go, and go she did. At the last, full of years and full of sorrows. In the spring of a year, near the close of the century, dying quietly in her own bed, in her own great house, with her priests about her and the familiar prayers in her ears. We are not told the manner of it, and perhaps it is better so, for we may imagine it as gentle, the long fierce life winding down at last, like a fire burning low in the grate, the proud heart growing still. She had spent years making herself ready for exactly this, and there can be little terror in death for one who has already watched almost everyone she loved go before her into it. There may even have been, beneath the proper Christian hope, a kind of weariness ready at last for rest. By her own wish, she was carried north, the long last journey, to be buried beside the husband she had loved across 60 years of memory. Laid down at last in the quiet green country where so much of the story had begun. Picture that last journey, the slow progress of the old Duchess home to her rest. They bore her body the long way north, out of the soft southern country where she had died up through the heart of the kingdom her family had fought so long to rule, to the place that had been the seat of her husband's house, where he himself had been laid at last after his own bones were brought home from the dishonour of Wakefield. There, in the church the family had raised and beautified, she was buried beside him, the husband she had married as a girl and shared 60 years with and outlived by 30. The two of them laid down together at the end, after all the long separation of his death, side by side, in the quiet of the place where so much of their story had begun. It was a homecoming of a kind, the only kind left to her, the reuniting in death of a partnership that life and war had torn apart. And around them, in that same ground and others, lay the dust of the house they had made together, the children and the children's children. The whole bright doomed dynasty come home at last to the earth. The Rose of Raby, who had been a girl in the cold northern castles, who had borne 12 children and buried almost all of them, who had been lifted to the height of the world and cast down into the depths of grief, who had been proud Cis and the mother of kings, and at the last an old woman at prayer in the dark, was home, and her watch was over, and the long story was done. The storm was all over, the watch was all ended. The Rose of Raby was home. There is a particular cruelty reserved for those who live very long, the cruelty of outliving, and it fell upon Cecily Neville more heavily than upon almost anyone we can name. To have borne so many children, with so much labour and so much danger, across so many years, and then to have followed nearly every one of them to the grave, is a sorrow almost too large to take in. We speak easily of a mother burying a child, and we know it for one of the heaviest of all human griefs, the wrong order of things, the parent outliving the child whose whole purpose was to outlive the parent. But Cecily did not bury one child or two. She buried, one way or another, nearly the whole of her dozen, the babies in their cradles, and the daughters in childbed, and the sons on the battlefield and in the tower. Almost every one of them gone before her, until at the very end there was scarcely anyone left to mourn her in turn. Try to hold the whole of it in the mind at once, the sheer accumulation of loss across a single long life, each grief laid upon the last. The lost infants, and then Anne, and then Edmund, and then George, and then the grandsons, and then Edward, and then Richard. The losses coming and coming across the decades until she stood alone at the end of them all. The last leaf on a stripped tree. There is no measuring such a weight of sorrow, and no real understanding it from the outside, and we should not pretend to. We can only sit with it for a moment, and marvel that any soul could carry so much and not be crushed, and recognize in her endurance something that goes beyond the ordinary strength of human beings into a kind of greatness all its own. The greatness not of triumph, but of bearing, the capacity to suffer the unbearable and remain somehow unbroken and upright, and herself to the very end. And yet she bore it, as she bore everything, without breaking. Perhaps that is the deepest thing about her, deeper even than the pride, this terrible capacity for endurance, this refusal to be destroyed by losses that would have destroyed almost anyone. And there is a strange greatness in her place at the very root of it all, when you stand back and see the whole shape of the thing. For she was the source, the mother from whom the whole bright doomed dynasty flowed, and everything that happened across those decades of glory and blood flowed, in a sense, out of her body, out of the children she bore in the curtained room. 2 kings of England came out of her, and through her daughters, the dukes and the claimants and the pretenders who carried the quarrel on for 2 generations more. The whole long drama that filled the chronicles, the battles and the crownings and the murders and the betrayals, was at bottom the story of her children and her children's children, the working out across a kingdom and half a century of the lives that had begun in her. She was the still centre of it, the woman the whole vast violent pattern radiated out from, and she outlived the entire pattern, saw it begin and saw it end, was there at the source and there at the close, the alpha and the omega of the House of York. Few human beings have ever stood in quite such a place, at the root and the end of so much history, and fewer still have borne it as she bore it, with that unbreakable upright dignity, that refusal to be crushed. She was not a queen, though she had the blood and the bearing for it, and claimed the style of one at the last. She held no office, led no armies, sat on no throne. She was a wife and a mother, that and nothing more, in the way her age understood those words. And yet she was, for all that, one of the towering figures of her century, the great matriarch at the heart of the age. The woman who gave it its kings, and outlived its tragedies, and remembered, at the end, when all the rest were dust, the whole of what had been. The men made the noise of history, the marching and the fighting and the dying. But she made the men, and outlasted them, and held the memory of them, and in that quiet way she was greater and more enduring than any of them. The mother of it all, the last one standing, the keeper of the whole vanished world. She was made, by her blood and her nature and the hard schooling of her age, into a woman who could not be broken. And the long cruelty of outliving everyone tested that to the very limit, and never quite cracked it. And it is worth saying, as we sit with her at the end, that she was not alone in her kind, for the long wars that consumed her children were, in a strange and a true sense, a war of mothers, fought through their sons by a handful of fierce and formidable women, of whom she was one. There was the French queen of the broken king Henry, who fought for 30 years for her husband's crown and her one precious son, and lost, at the last, husband and son, and cause together, and ended a broken exile. There was the upstart queen, the Woodville widow her own son had married, who schemed and clung to defend her children when their father died and left them to the mercy of their uncle. And there was another, a small, patient, determined woman who spent a whole lifetime working in secret and in shadow to set her one son upon the throne, and who succeeded, in the end, where all the armies failed, ending the wars by making her boy the king and founding the dynasty that supplanted them all. These were the true players of the long game, the mothers, each fighting with the only weapons a man's world left to women, with marriage and money and intrigue and the slow, patient work of years, each pouring her whole self into the survival and the rise of her children. The crowns were won and lost on the battlefields by the men with the swords. But behind every one of those men stood a woman who had borne him and raised him and schemed for him. And the deepest currents of the whole quarrel ran through the hearts of these formidable mothers. Cecily was not the least of them. She bore 2 kings and outlived them both, and she is the one we have chosen to sit with tonight. But she stood in a company of such women, each of them a mother, each of them fighting and grieving for her children, each of them, in the end, made to drink the cup to its dregs. And so we leave her, where we found her, the old woman by the low fire, her worn book of prayers in her folded hands, her pale eyes on the embers, and all her children alive again in the flames, just for tonight. Just for as long as we sit here with her, the lost babies, and Anne, who married for love and died too young, and golden Edward, who was a king, and Edmund cut down on the bridge, and quiet Elizabeth, whose sons would not let the cause die, and bold Margaret across the sea, and poor George in his barrel of wine, and small dark Richard with the crown on his helmet in the field. She gave them life, every one, and she gave them up, every one, and she remembered them, every one, to the very end. That is what a mother does. In the end, even a mother of kings, she remembers. And now, for a little while, so have we. If these quiet evenings are something you would like to find your way back to, you are welcome to stay a while longer in this company, and to let this be a place you return to when the dark comes early and the house is still. There is no need to do anything at all. There is only sleep now, waiting for you, and the warm dark, and the long memory of a mother and her children growing soft and far away as you drift. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.